Welcome back to Fox Novel Tales. Tonight the air is thick with stories, and we're about to wander into one worth savouring. This particular tale smells of salt spray carried on the late summer breeze, mingled with the faint, sweet dust of chalk that clings stubbornly to the old wooden desks of a classroom nearing its final curtain call. It is a story about the precise, fragile moment when the boundless ocean of adolescent dreams collides, just momentarily, with the narrow, charted course of adulthood, a collision so gentle you might not even notice it happening, until the very sand beneath your feet shifts. The weight of the world, or at least the weight of the National High School graduation exam, was beginning to press down upon our young heroes. Yet even under that pressure, the heart insists on its own, far more complicated geometry. You probably wouldn't make it through this entire journey without shedding at least one tear for the sheer unrepeatable beauty of being 18. But I encourage you to try anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please share this video with your friends, perhaps on your favorite social network, or simply tell someone near you that you're about to listen to a story from the coast, noting the time where you are now. Now let us draw near as the words lift off the page and carry us into a world that feels both distant and impossibly close. August, the last month of summer, the one people still call back-to-school season, always carries a peculiar flavor, a blend of the gentle ache of impending partings and the sharp new scent of pristine white pages, not yet smudged. In this small seaside town, where the rhythm of life is measured by fishing boats slipping into the harbor at dawn and the ceaseless murmur of waves, my senior year of high school for me, Lamb, began like that, with a certain heaviness, because everyone understood this was the last year we were allowed to live inside the safe bubble, woven of differential equations and aimless kite-flying afternoons. I sat in the corner of the classroom by the window, where the early sun made the tiny dust motes stand out as they danced in the room's stillness, a choreography I knew by heart, better than the physics formulas Teacher Kwang droned through in his even stern voice. My desk, like those of my peers, had been etched by time and the mischief of generations, awkward love confessions, forgotten nicknames, and I, with a dull pencil and a thick draft notebook, was only a wanderer in my own private world. That world, built from clumsy lines of verse and unfinished chords on the old guitar lying mute beneath my bed, was the only place I didn't feel hemmed in by the invisible expectations my mother, Mrs. Lan, kept laying on my shoulders. With her small eyes, always bright with nameless worry, she wanted me to choose a smooth road, a steady job where I wouldn't have to face the harshness of the real world she had tasted more than enough of. "Lamb, what are you writing so intently?" Koi's voice, low and full of life, like nets being hauled up from the sea, shattered my reverie. Koi, my friend since the days we still wore shorts, broad-shouldered like the white-crested waves, was always the anchor holding me to the ground, even when the ground felt too rigid. He sat at the desk behind me and often popped his head over to inspect my draft pages, the things he called useless lines that somehow sound cool. I snapped the notebook shut, a reflex of someone guarding a secret. "Just taking notes, Koi. Teacher Kwang's talking about the law of conservation of energy, and I'm trying to imagine if it applies to romance." Koi laughed, his voice echoing through our usually quiet corner, drawing a few glances from the front rows. "What do you figure, romance being conserved? I bet it evaporates the moment you face a chemistry test. Look, Nam's glaring at us like we just committed treason." I glanced toward Nam, the top student in our class, hunched over his desk, eyes behind thick lenses tight with permanent tension. He had no time for fripperies like poetry or romance. To Nam, Life was a chain of scores to be achieved. "Forget Nam," I murmured, my voice a shade unsteady. "Do you feel how rushed everything is this year, Koi? It's like an hourglass has been flipped and the sand's falling faster every day." Koi tapped my shoulder, a pat full of meaning. "So what, future musician? This is our last year we're allowed to be students. Later, if you don't become a musician, at least be a man who picks up his phone on time. Don't worry so much. Just live all the way with your draft verses, at least until the teacher calls on you for an oral quiz." I gave him a thin smile, grateful for his candor. He always knew how to soothe my fragile heart with a frankness that never turned cruel. In this cramped world of school, Koi was the needed balance, the echo of our afternoons playing soccer on wet sand. But deep inside me, something else had begun to kindle, a kind of inspiration I had never known, something I feared would upend the safe illusion I had worked so hard to build. And then, on a humid Monday morning after a night's rain, she appeared. The classroom door opened, not with the familiar clatter of the chronically late, but with a gentle motion, almost soundless. She stood there under the yellowish light of the hallway, a slender figure, long black hair glossy as velvet, neatly braided, a pristine white traditional long dress, an image too pure amid the noisy, jostling air of a class about to step across the threshold into adulthood. She was Van. She was the new transfer student, and teacher Kwang, with his usual grave expression, introduced her in a voice full of expectation. "Class, this is Van. She'll sit next to Lam, the only seat left." The room went quiet for a beat. Then the whispering began, because the arrival of a new face, especially one as gentle and lovely as hers, is always an event in a small town. I felt my heart stumble, not out of fear of losing focus on my studies, but something else entirely, a guileless tremor I hardly recognized in myself. I looked into her eyes, large, uncommonly bright, carrying a composure that made me wonder what they had already seen along the roads she'd traveled before stopping here. Van dipped her head in a small bow, then walked toward my desk. Each step seemed to carry its own subtle music, a delicacy I'd never noticed in anyone else in our class. When she pulled out the old wooden chair, its familiar creak sounded different, as if it were lamenting the first time it had to bear the weight of such unblemished beauty. She set her stack of textbooks down neatly, without a single unnecessary sound, and sat. The distance between us, no more than a thin plank of wood, seemed to shrink in a way I couldn't explain. I could catch her faint scent, not the sharpness of perfume, but the fragrance of soap and perhaps the smell of new paper. I tried to turn to the window, pretending to be absorbed in the distant beach where the waves kept breaking without end, but my mind was wholly occupied by the new presence beside me. I am Lam, a dreamer who lives on poetry, and it felt as if a muse had accidentally dropped her smile onto the open page of my draft notebook. I didn't know what to say. No line I knew could hold this quickening. And in that moment, I understood. The safe world I had so carefully built had just been breached by something so beautiful it was almost frightening. Van's presence beside me wasn't a storm crashing in. It was a slow-rising tide, steadily flooding the long, dry sandbanks of my heart. In the first days after she took that old wooden chair, the air between us thickened with shyness, the sweet kind only those just discovering love can truly feel. I didn't dare look straight at her for long, afraid my habitual, melancholy gaze would betray the riot inside my chest, a new rhythm that had replaced the familiar pulse of the sea. I only stole glances, collecting small details, the way she smoothed her hair, the way her slender fingers moved across a textbook page, and especially the way morning light fell from the window and turned her pale skin into a soft radiance, like the light from a forgotten Renaissance painting. I began to write. The draft pages that once scattered with petty philosophical musings about existence and complaints about academic pressure were cleared and put in order. Everything narrowed to a single subject, Van. I wrote about her eyes, which I likened to two still lakes our little town never had. I wrote about her serene silence, a music I longed to harmonize with. Those first verses, naive and awkward, were set down in bright blue ink, trembling as much as my hand did. One afternoon, while teacher Kwang was engrossed in a complicated theorem, I dropped my old fountain pen. It rolled in a loop under the desk and stopped right at Van's feet. I ducked down to reach for it, and in adolescent clumsiness bumped my head against the desk's edge, just hard enough to make a small clack, enough to draw notice. "Lam, are you okay?" Van's voice sounded, for the first time speaking my name, light as wind chimes. I looked up, my face burning, and saw she had already bent to pick up the pen. Her hand brushed mine as she passed it back. In that instant it felt like a shock, and all I managed to stammer was the most foolish sentence in my personal history of conversation. "Thank you. It's the pen I use to draw the things I can't say." Van smiled, a small, barely parted smile, but it was enough to melt every layer of ice in me. She didn't ask what I was drawing, didn't press or judge. She only looked straight into my eyes, and I felt as if she had already read every secret page I'd ever kept. "Then," she said, strangely calm, "I hope those things are beautiful enough to deserve the pen." And just like that, the wall of silence between us showed its first hairline cracks. The days that followed slid into a new orbit, slower and softer, removed from the scramble of classmates like Nam or Lee, who were sprinting through mock exams day and night. At lunch, instead of running out to the soccer field with Coy, I found reasons to linger. Van often stayed by herself, reading under the shade of the old flame tree in the courtyard, or sometimes sitting at her desk, sipping from a small carton of milk. "Van," I mustered my courage once the room had emptied, "do you want to have lunch with me? I brought a sandwich. My mum made it a bit clumsily, but it'll definitely be enough." Van looked up, her eyes flashing a little surprise. "Thanks, Lam, but I brought a lunchbox. My dad says I should eat home-cooked food to stay healthy." She pointed to a neat, insulated container on the desk. I was briefly disappointed, and hid it as quickly as I could. "Right. I forgot, your family is, more put together than mine." I laughed at my own awkwardness. Sensing it, she added quickly, "But I can share some with you. My mom makes great pepper-braised fish. I know you don't really like fish, but—" "I don't hate fish," I cut in, maybe too fast. "I just don't like the ones that are too big, too fierce. I like small things, the kind you can hold in your palm, like—" I stopped, not daring to say "you do." Van looked at me, and this time she truly laughed, clear as morning light. "Then you're in luck. These are tiny anchovies, pepper-braised, just right to hold in your hand." So we ate together in the classroom's near-perfect hush. For the first time, I witnessed the quiet delicacy of her eating, unhurried, unnoisy, as if each bite of rice were part of a sacred ritual. In the days after, I grew bolder in expressing my feelings in the only language I knew, poetry. I didn't dare say things outright. Direct words often felt too bare, lacking the sheen I always sought. Instead, I wrote letters by hand. On lined notebook paper, I carefully trimmed the margins, folding them into tiny paper airplanes, or sometimes pressing a dry leaf flat to carry the note. "Van," I whispered, placing a dry leaf with a small slip of paper on her desk, while she was on the phone with Mai, her new friend. "This is homework, but written in another language." Van set the phone down, her eyes softening when she saw my homemade envelope. She opened it slowly, and as she read, A concentrated seriousness gathered on her face as though she were decoding an ancient cipher. "Lamb," she looked up, her voice barely rising above the clack of the ceiling fan. "These verses, they're beautiful, but why are they so sad?" I felt as if I were standing at a cliff's edge, and she had just asked me why I didn't fly. Sad? Maybe because I live in a world where beauty always comes with brevity, Van. The most beautiful things are the ones we can't keep. She folded the letter gently and slipped it into her desk. But why not keep it? If it's beautiful, it deserves to be kept, doesn't it? Like how we store memories, no matter how brief. "You're right," I sighed, oddly relieved to meet someone who could see through my inherent artist's pessimism. Do you like it?" She gazed out the window, where the sky had begun to turn the deep blue of late afternoon. "I do, Lamb. I like the way you look at the world through music and poetry. It makes everything around us, even the dismissal bell, feel more meaningful." That honest reply was the strongest tonic for my flickering confidence. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wrote more. And Van began to answer with her own small notes, not poems but simple questions about life, about the book she was reading, about the places she had lived before coming here. Our connection was forged not only in the classroom, but also along the narrow coastal road, where the wind carried the ocean's salt breath, and the whisper of casuarina pines was a soundtrack that never ended. Those were the afternoons after cram classes, when exam pressure tightened across everyone's narrow shoulders, and we found release by pedaling side by side. I rode my rickety bike, and Van her pristine white Japanese bicycle. We went slowly, in no hurry to get home. For me, home was a place of my mother and her heavy expectations. For Van, I guessed it was a place being prepared for some far-off future. "Lamb, do you feel it?" Van asked when we stopped at a stretch of rocky seawall where the waves hit hardest. "Every time I bike past here, I feel like I'm trying to catch up with something, but I don't know what it is." I braced my foot and stared at the horizon, aflame with orange. "That's the feeling of youth, Van. It always runs faster than our will, and all we can do is pedal after it, hoping it pauses long enough for us to gasp for breath." "You sound like a philosopher," Van laughed softly. "But you never seem out of breath. You always look calm, even while carrying an ocean of unwritten verses." "Because you're here," I said without thinking, the words flowing like an unchecked current. "You're a gentle anchor, keeping my heart from being swept away by reality's oversized waves." She turned fully to face me, and for the first time the mystery in her eyes gave way to unguarded tenderness. "Lamb, I don't know what to say. Everywhere I've lived, people are too busy becoming someone, doing something. They don't have time to watch sunsets or listen to the waves." "Then why did you stop here?" I asked, the question that had weighed on me since she arrived. "This town is small and old. It doesn't have the big opportunities you deserve." Van lowered her head and stroked the handlebars. "Maybe I stopped because I needed a pause. I needed a place to remember before I have to go far. I needed a pure memory, unsmudged by calculations or grand plans. And maybe—" She looked up, her eyes now a blend of honesty and a faraway sadness I couldn't yet read. "Maybe I needed someone to teach me how to feel the small things. I can teach you," I said, feeling like a child entrusted with a sacred charge. "I can teach you to see the poem in the rain, to hear the melody in the wind slipping through your fingers. I can show you a world beyond numbers and preset goals." Van stepped closer, and the space between us was only a breath. "Lamb, you're the first person who hasn't asked me about grades or my study abroad plans. You only asked me about the sunset. Because the sunset is the one thing we can share right now without worrying about tomorrow," I whispered, feeling as if I'd climbed to the height of romance. I reached out, touching her hand where it rested on the handlebars. Van didn't pull away. She let my hand cover hers. Her hand was colder than I'd imagined, but its softness sent a warm current up my arm. "Then let's savor it," Van said, her voice full of resolve. "Let's savor these guileless days, Lamb, because we both know they won't last." Sweet as they were, her words carried a warning that made me shiver. But I was already too deep inside the bubble. I didn't want to think about endings. I only wanted these cycling afternoons to stretch on forever, where I could be her musician, and she could always be my muse, between the sound of the waves and promises the wind would carry away. The bond between us spread invisibly, but our closest friends couldn't help noticing. My Van's quick-witted friend was the first to speak up, of course, with a curious, impish tone. "Hey, Van, you've had your head in the clouds lately," Mai teased as our group gathered at the usual street-side iced tea stand. "Every time I ask about homework, you stare out the window and say, 'I'm feeling the rhythm of stillness.' Are you dating, Lamb?" Van blushed, but she didn't deny it. She merely shook her head, her eyes full of meaning. "I'm not dating, Mai. I'm learning to see the world through a different lens." Mai turned to me, sharp-eyed. "Lamb, what are you doing with my best friend? You know she's a gem, right? Don't shatter her with your philosophical poems." Koi, chewing a chunk of watermelon, chimed in with mock gravity. "She's right, Lamb. Van's the kind of girl my mum says you should only admire from afar. Future beauty queen material, while you're a guitar that's out of tune." I laughed at Koi's comparison, while a quiet pride rose in me. "I won't break anything, Koi. I'm just trying to accompany her so the song rings true. Then make it ring fast." Lai, the bold friend who always pushed me to think bigger, threw in. "If you love each other, say it, fight for it. Don't let something this beautiful get buried under exam schedules." Lai's words touched the hidden fear in me. I looked at Van, who absorbed everything with remarkable composure. "Lai's right," I admitted. "But I don't know how to fight things without a face, family pressure, life paths already drawn. I only know how to write." Van took my hand, our first public gesture, and my heart stopped for a beat. "Lamb, I don't need you to fight. I need you to be yourself. What we have here in this bubble is real. Let's cherish it even if it's fragile." And so we kept living inside that special love bubble. It was built of shared lunches, clumsy handwritten notes passed beneath the desk, and idle afternoons by the sea, where the waves seemed to sing a hymn to innocence that cannot be kept. I felt I had found an inexhaustible source of inspiration, and Van, the mysterious girl newly arrived, had become the indispensable muse in my unfinished symphony. We loved with everything we had, within the safe, sweet limits of the last days before the door of reality was ready to swing wide. October came knocking, and with the first cool autumn winds sweeping through the seaside town, the giant hourglass of 18 tilted decisively. The air in the classroom was no longer the drowsy haze of midday dreams. It had condensed into an invisible pressure, compressing every thought, every act. The pencils gnawing at scratch paper no longer sounded like the nibble of creation, but the grind of calculation. The handwritten letters between Van and me still changed hands, but their themes had begun to shift, no longer just flirtations in verse, but braided with questions about scores, about exam subjects, and, more importantly, about plans. I, Lamb, kept trying to wear the shell of a musician in search of inspiration, but even the verses I wrote for Van were tinged with worry. I no longer described my muse as a bloom in a garden, but as a star slowly drifting out of the familiar orbit of our town's night sky. One evening, as I sat beside my old guitar in my cramped room, the smell of damp and old paper twined together, my mother, Mrs. Lan, came in. She didn't knock. Privacy in this house is a luxury we can't afford. With her kindly face and lips always pressed tight with worry, she glanced over the stacks of books and stopped at the guitar. "Lamb." Her voice was low and steady, like an important news bulletin. "I see you've been holding that guitar more than your physics review sheets. How old are you now?" I set my hand on the strings, trying to coax the gentlest note I could. "I'm 18, Mom. I know, but I need to keep my soul from drying out before the exams." She sighed, heavy as nets hauled up from the deep. Sitting on the edge of my bed, she looked at me not with reproach, but with the weariness of someone who has carried too much. "Your soul needs feeding, I know, but, son, you can't live on poetry and half-finished notes. I've worked all my life so you could have this desk so you wouldn't have to go to sea early like your father. Do you think about the future?" "My future is here, Mom," I said, striving for calm. "In what I feel, I can write music. I can do something meaningful." "What is meaningful?" she cut in, her patience thinning. "Meaningful is a stable job, an income so you and I don't panic every time the weather shifts. The provincial teachers' college will set you on a smooth road. Stop dreaming, Lamb. Dreams don't feed an empty stomach, and they don't pay the utility bills." Harsh as they were, her words were the truest mirror of the limits I faced. I couldn't blame her. Her pragmatism had been forged by years of want. I lowered my head. "I understand, Mom. I'll try." "Trying isn't enough." She stood, smoothing my hair, a rare gentleness hidden under her sternness. "Focus on the subjects that matter. Don't let those romantic feelings cloud your eyes. Life isn't always lovely lines of verse." She left me alone with the guitar and the weight in my chest. I looked out the window, where whitecaps kept shouldering the shore, and wondered whether my love for Van was one of those romantic feelings my mother wanted stricken from the top of my list. While my world was being cinched tight by family expectations, Van's, I realized, was being shaped by plans far larger. The difference between us began to show through Mai's stray remarks. Quick-witted as ever, Mai sometimes let slip things Van hadn't wanted me to hear. Once, when I was sitting alone in a corner of the schoolyard, trying to write a poem about an unnamed parting, Mai came running, face alight. "Lamb, you have to hear this," she burst out, almost breathless. "Our Van is about to take a giant step. Her parents just finalized her study abroad papers to the U.S. Oh my God, the U.S.! I heard it's a prestigious school, international business or something. Van's about to become the most accomplished person this town has seen." It felt like a rock dropped straight into the love bubble we'd been trying to maintain. International business, the U.S., a world too far, too vast, too different from the narrow, stable road my mother wanted for me here. "Really?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "What did Van say about it?" My shrugged excitement dimming as she caught my mood. "She didn't say much, Lamb, just that it's necessary for her future. Her family takes it very seriously. I bet she's trying to stay calm, but she's worried. She told me, 'Mai, I need a beautiful memory to carry with me, something truly original to youth.'" "An original memory," I murmured. That was the poems, the afternoons by the sea we had shared. I understood. Van wasn't just preparing for a trip. She was preparing for an entirely different life, a life where I, with my old guitar and clumsy lines, might have no place. That night, I pedaled to the beach where the waves struck hardest, as if to dissolve my tangled thoughts into the ocean's growl. I didn't write. I simply watched distant fishing boats trying to hold themselves to the harbor. Van was already there. In a thin sweater, she stood with her back to me, staring out at the water, as if measuring the distance between us and the future. "Lamb," she called as I approached, her voice carrying on the wind. "I know you've heard." I sat beside her on the cold stone seawall. "I heard what Mai said. The US international business, an open future. I spoke the words mechanically, like reading a cool news brief. Van turned, and for the first time all year, I saw tears gathered in those bright, wide eyes, though she held them back. Lamb, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. My family decided very quickly. My father, he has very clear plans for me. He believes studying abroad is the only sure route to success. And what about me? My voice rasped. Where do I fit in that grand design? Am I a pretty stanza you'll fold and tuck into a drawer before you board the plane? She shook her head hard. Never. Lamb, you're not a stanza. You're an entire collection I've read and reread. But we have to be realistic. You know I can't stay, and I can't ask you to give up everything to follow a path you're not ready for, or a path your family won't bless. But I can go with you. The desperation surged, overrunning my usual quiet. I can study, I can change, I can write music anywhere. As long as you're there, I can do it. She lifted a hand to my cheek, her touch unexpectedly warm in the chill evening wind. Don't say that, Lamb. You know it isn't easy. You have an artist's soul. You need the calm of this sea to compose. You don't belong to big noisy cities or to business pressure. Your mom already said so. Besides, she drew a long breath, I have to go. It's my father's choice, and I want to prove I can be independent, even if it's along the path he set. Does that independence include forgetting what we've had? I asked, looking straight into her eyes, searching for a promise I could hold. She stayed silent for a long time. The sun was gone. A deep violet spread across the water. I won't forget, she said at last, though the words gave no comfort. But distance is a trial. Not every love survives, Lamb. We're standing at two different forks in the road. Your path is steady, safe, and close to what you love. Mine is open, far, and filled with new things I have to learn. She rose and reached for her bicycle. We've had the most guileless, beautiful days, Lamb. We loved with everything. But schoolyard love is like summer waves, glorious and impossible to keep when storm season comes. I stood, feeling drained of strength. I knew the promises I'd launched into the air could not stand against the realities packed into study abroad suitcases. Poetry cannot keep a beloved from choices demanded by distance and family design. So, we accept, I asked, not a question to Van, but to myself. She looked at me with a compassion I knew would haunt me. We have to, Lamb, because if we try to cling to something beautiful that doesn't belong to our future, we'll ruin the best memories we have. And then, no accusations, no tears falling in that moment, only the heavy silence of two people realizing that even after loving with everything, their love was too fragile before the strictures of life. We turned our bikes and pedaled in opposite directions under the dingy yellow streetlights, carrying the weight of an unwanted coming of age. After that fateful night on the stone seawall, when the truth of our diverging orbits lay exposed beneath the town's wan yellow streetlights, time seemed to grow viscous, crawling past like thick honey. The weeks that followed moved through a taut but orderly calm, as all of us were swept into the harsh rhythm of the final mock exams. Van and I still sat side by side, but our exchanges shifted from clumsy brushes of hands to polite nods, a painful yet necessary change to preserve what was left. We were learning how to say goodbye without ever uttering the word. I realized that clinging to a relationship whose future already wore stark boundary lines was selfish, just holding fast to the mirage of romance. Our love, lovely as the first sunlight through the casuarina trees, could not survive in the vacuum of distance and diverging aims. I had to let go, not because I loved her less, but because I loved her too much to make her carry the weight of an unworkable bond into a new life. I spent that entire week doing something I'd never imagined I would. gathering my feelings into order. I didn't write anything new. Every possible line felt meaningless before what was about to unfold. Instead, I dug out all the old draft pages, the tiny paper planes, the clumsy handwritten letters I'd given Van from the day she arrived, through the truest confessions I'd managed. I trimmed away the margins smudged by sweaty hands, arranged everything in time-zone sequence, and bound it into a sheaf of yellowed pages, with a thin seagrass twine I'd picked up on the beach. It was a chronology of a nameless love, a relic from the innocent days now gone. We met one last time on a Saturday afternoon at our familiar beach, the one that had kept our secrets in the hour of sunset. The sky was uncannily blue, not a single cloud in sight, as if the universe were trying to ease the heaviness inside us with a flawless, indifferent beauty. Van arrived first, wearing a cream sweater, elegant and more distant than ever, as if she had already stepped into the world ahead. She didn't ask what I'd been doing these past weeks, and she didn't mention the exams. Our silence was no longer shyness. It was the deep respect one grants a chapter that has closed. When I approached with the bundle, Van offered a small smile, stripped of its usual radiance. "You came," she said, her voice light, echoing between the waves. "I thought you might not." "I had to," I answered, hesitating before sitting beside her on the sand that had already cooled. "I need to give you this before it's too late, before you truly leave." I handed her the pages. She hesitated, then received them gently. Her eyes moved over the scrawled title on the cover, where I'd hurriedly written, "Fleeting Memories of the Sea Breeze." "Lamb," she said, this time a tear clearly sliding to the corner of her eye before she quickly brushed it away. "You didn't have to do this. These are yours." "No, Van." I shook my head, feeling a strange serenity spreading through me. "They're yours. They're the feelings you stirred in me. I used to write because I was lonely, because I needed someone to tell these things to. Now I'm not lonely anymore, because I have these memories as companions. I don't want you to carry an unnamed burden into a wholly new life. Take them as a gift, as a thank you." Van held the pages to her chest, clutching them as if they were the most precious thing in the world. "Lamb, you're making me cry." "I'm sorry," I said, though I felt no regret. "But if you cry, let it be tears of release, not regret. These lines prove how innocently, how purely I loved. I don't ask you to remember every verse, every word. I only hope you'll keep them as a beautiful memory of school days, a chapter we wrote together." She looked up at me, her gaze softened now, free of the tension of future calculations. "I'll keep them. I'll take them with me. I won't open them every day because if I read them too often I won't be able to keep walking, but I'll tuck them away carefully, right next to the photos of this beach." We sat for a long time without speaking, letting the sound of waves say what we no longer could. It was the most painful kind of acceptance, because it carried no anger, no fight, only the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful love is the kind without a fairy tale ending. "Van," I finally said, breaking the quiet with a wry little smile, "do you remember the first time I dropped my pen? I told you I used it to draw the things I couldn't say. Now I've said them, if only through these lines. And you listened." She nodded, a final tear slipping down her cheek, and then she smiled for real, sad but at peace. "I listened, Lamb, and I learned so much from you about gentleness. I never imagined someone so quiet could hold such fierce feeling. That fierceness was for you," I said, "and I give you the same in return," she replied, steady now. "But, Lamb, you have to promise me something." "Anything," I said at once. Promise me you won't let these lines hold you back. Keep writing, keep composing, but write about new things. Let these words be a finished page, and then write the next chapters, brighter. I looked at her and understood that she wasn't only letting me go. She was blessing me to go on, to keep dreaming even after my muse had flown. Whatever selfishness I had dissolved, replaced by the simple wish that she be happy on her wide, open road. I promise, I said, my voice firm. I won't let them become a weight. I'll treat them as the most precious gem I've ever had, kept carefully, set apart from everyday life. We stood. Night had taken the shore. Only the weak harbour lights sketched a path across the water. We shared a long embrace, no rush, no clinging, only the acknowledgement that we had loved with everything in the brief span time allowed. I'll keep in touch, Van said, a promise as fragile as the seagrass twine around the pages. I know, I answered, and we both understood it as the final courtesy of youth, a way to walk away without tearing ourselves open. Distance, new experiences, and the tilt of our separate orbits would wear us thin, then smooth us into a beautiful memory, a clear dream no one dares to wake. We parted there without looking back for too long. I biked home feeling as if I had shrugged off a coat too heavy to carry, even as my chest still ached with emptiness. Van had stepped onto her wide road, and I, with a bitter kind of acceptance, turned back to my unfinished scratch pages, with a fresh maturity paid for by the price of a first love, broken. 10 years. 10 years is long enough to turn a small seaside town, where the waves hush you like a lullaby into a far-off memory, hazy as an old photograph bleached by the harsh sun. I, Lamb, am no longer the skinny boy with somber eyes, knees pulled up by a 12th grade window. I have grown up in the sense my mother, Mrs. Lan, always wished, a stable life, a paying job, a small, well-lit apartment in the middle of this noisy city. I work at a communications company specializing in audio and production, a job that demands precision, logic, and at times the coolness needed to keep projects from skidding off their financial rails. I no longer cradle the old guitar. It's tucked away in a storage room corner, under a thick skin of dust like the unfinished notes of the old days. I no longer write poems. Soaring words and florid metaphors have been replaced by technical terms, numbers that talk and emails that expect instant replies. I have become a practical man. One Lai would probably call too predictable, and Coy would say has forgotten the sound of the sea. And yet there are nights when, after the work is done and the streetlights outside go dim with the city's fatigue, some stray melody slipping out of my headphones has the terrible power to drag me upstream through time, back to the damp shoreline and the old study desk. Tonight is one of those nights. I'm at my computer trying to fine-tune the audio for a product spot, when a gentle background track with a simple acoustic lilt slips into my ear. It isn't a famous song, just a very old melody, perhaps written by some anonymous songwriter in the 90s. But to me it's the underscore to those afternoons pedaling side by side with Van. I close my eyes. The cold blue of the screen gives way to the blazing amber of a seaside sunset. I see Van's hand settle lightly on mine as she took the old fountain pen. I hear her clear laughter, the one I once likened to wind chimes. The foolish romance of 18 rushes back, so strong it steals my breath. The Lamb of now, a grown man, takes in the endearing naivete of the lamb I was. You once believed poetry could change the world, didn't you? I murmur inwardly. A kind of self-conversation I seldom allow. I get up and go to the bookcase, where I keep the only memento from school days, the old bundle of draft pages tied with a thin seagrass twine. I haven't opened it in years, just kept it as a witness, a quiet presence from a past, no longer within reach. I ease the twine loose. The pages have yellowed, the blue ink has paled, yet the lines, clumsy as they are, remain sharp in my mind. I turn to a random page. It's the poem I wrote about her eyes, which I called "Two Still Lakes This Tiny Town Could Never Possess." I smile, bittersweet. Van is no longer my muse, because that muse boarded a great ship and sailed, flew, to a horizon my verses could never reach. And I, Lamb, am no longer a dreamer of a musician, because the guitar is silent, and my soul has learned to pack its feelings into digital sound boxes. You are not the muse, I whisper, my voice hoarse with the distance of time, and I am no longer the dreamer musician. This feeling isn't regret for failing to hold on. It's acceptance that everything has its moment and its limit. Our love was like a strong sea wind, beautiful, but impossible to anchor. This love is light as wind, yet presses grooves upon the heart. I read a line I once wrote to her, suddenly realizing it was the very lightness and clarity of that love that carved the deepest grooves when it vanished. I remember the fragile promise by the sea. I'll keep in touch, but we both knew it was impossible. Keeping in touch is an endlessly stretched cord, a quiet torture when each of you lives in a different universe. Van was learning how to steer big corporations. I was learning how to balance mixes. We no longer spoke the same language. I turned to the last page of the bundle, where I wrote about parting without tears. I remember the compassion in her eyes, the composure she used to mask the sadness of yielding to her family's designs. This tender love is fragile. Broken now, so be it, I say, closing the bundle. This break isn't a tragedy, it's an inevitability, a rite of passage from youth into adulthood. I decide. I won't contact Van. I won't look for her on social media, won't try to learn about her life through my or anyone else. Doing so would only harm the lovely memory we made. I must return to her the freedom she needs for that wide-open road, and I need the same freedom to go on with my life. Set aside the guileless days, return them all unto you. I tie the seagrass twine back around the poems and put the bundle away. But this time, I don't leave it in the storage closet. I bring it to my desk and set it beside the monitor glowing with complicated spreadsheets. I am no longer a dreamer musician, but I can use the precision of craft to recreate memory in the most faithful way I know. I open the music software, find again the simple acoustic motifs I heard, and begin to write. But this time I don't write about Van. I don't write about love. I write about acceptance, about the beauty of a wordless parting, and how a memory can refuse to become a burden and instead turn into a quiet reserve of strength. I spend the whole night finishing that piece. It isn't self-pitying. It holds a still, resonant calm. It is gratitude. A few months later, I receive a strange email. The sender is from abroad. The name reads Van T. I open it with a mix of excitement and caution. The message is brief, written in professional English, yet I can feel the subtlety of her voice in it. Dear Lamb, I've just finished my 3rd year at school. Everything is as expected, lots of pressure, but I'm learning to balance. Yesterday, at a campus art exhibition, I heard a very familiar piece. It had no lyrics, but the melody, it made me think of wave-washed afternoons at home. I'm not sure who composed it, but it was beautiful, sad, and yet full of hope. I tried to find out, and a friend told me the event's sound was handled by someone connected to a well-known sound engineer in Vietnam. I don't know if that's you, but if it is, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for keeping those guileless memories so intact. I still have your bundle of poems. It's my treasure. I hope you are well, and that you are still making beautiful music. Van. I read the email again and again, not to find an invitation back, but to make sure she truly is all right. She has moved on, succeeded on the path she chose, and the memory of me doesn't weigh her down. I smile, truly this time, without bitterness, without awkwardness. I sit at the keyboard and slowly type a reply. Van, I write. I'm still here. I'm still underscoring the C, though now that C lives inside my headphones. The melody you heard is my gift to you, a last blessing. Keep flying high, don't come back searching for what's grown old. Let those guileless memories remain the most precious gem, kept whole in my heart, apart from everyday life. I don't send it. I said enough in the bundle tied with seagrass twine. Silence now is the most generous form of love. I close the email and return to the unfinished track. I am no longer a dreamer musician, and she is no longer my muse. That love has completed its work. It made me grow up. It taught me the distance between ideals and reality. And most of all, it gave me something I will always cherish. I take a sip of strong black coffee and look out at the city. Even if I no longer hear the waves, I can still feel their rhythm, the rhythm of a youth that was fully lived, if only for one brief bright moment. 10 years after the day I slipped the seagrass twine off that bundle of poems, I set foot again on the narrow concrete path skirting my hometown's shore. The air still carried its signature salt. No sound engineer in the city can truly recreate it, no matter how hard we try. But something had changed in how I breathed it in. It was no longer the scent of boundless freedom. It was the scent of a memory, carefully archived, neatly labeled, and shelved in the vaults of the mind. I wasn't back for a reunion. I was here to oversee an environmental sound project for a new resort near the harbour. Ironically, my job was to bring modernity and logic to the very place where improvisation and the unmeasurable once reigned. I drove a late-model car past spruced-up food stalls and old corner shops now flashing glossy signs, and felt as if I were watching a documentary about my own past, with a main character who had changed too much. I made my way to Aunt Anne's cafe, the old sanctuary of after-school meetups. The seaside cafe had expanded. The cozy clutter was gone, replaced by a minimalist, elegant look that catered to guests with finer taste. Aunt Anne was still there, more silver in her hair, but her dove-soft eyes as warm and knowing as ever. She recognized me instantly, even though I'd grown taller and traded my boyish thinness for the sturdy build of a man used to wrangling heavy gear. "Lamb, good heavens, boy, it's been ages since you came back to this town." She wiped her hands on her apron and pulled me into a hug, her familiar trace of herbs in the air. "Hello, Aunt Anne," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "You've been well?" "Strong as an ox. But do I miss you kids?" "That I do." She steered me to the old wooden table where I used to scribble. "Sit here. I'll make you an iced black coffee just how you liked it. But tell me, what brings you back? Big job?" "Yes," I nodded. "I'm setting up the sound for the new resort by the harbour. They want to recreate the peaceful sound of the sea for their guests." My tone held a touch of self-mockery. Aunt Anne sipped her tea, studying me as if searching for the boy who once came in hugging a guitar. "The peaceful sound of the sea. Must be paying you well to drag a busy man like you back here." "They pay fairly," I said. "But, Aunt, do you know how Coy's doing? I tried his old number, but it's dead." She laughed, a round, pleasant sound. "Coy? He's not going anywhere you could lose him. He's a child of the sea. He can't live far from this salt. He runs the biggest fishing fleet in the region now, Lamb. That boy, he didn't study as long as you or Van, but he knows how to live with reality." "Really?" "He's made it," I said, feeling genuine joy for him. Coy had always been the straightest soul among us. "Made it in his way," she emphasized. "Bought a brand-new boat and named her Nang Tho, Muse. I asked him why, and he just laughed that big laugh and said, 'Give the boat a name like that and my wife won't nag so much.' That boy, he's no dreamer, but he cherishes what he has and he doesn't chase the far off." Her words were like a sudden compass, pointing towards something I'd long chosen to ignore, a practical steadiness that doesn't require you to betray who you are. Coy had found that balance. I, meanwhile, had run from stability to pursue a career that looked more artistic, yet ran on logic and numbers. "Aunt, can I see Coy?" I asked, feeling a strong urge to mend a tether I'd let fray. "Of course. He's at the harbour most afternoons, checking shipments. Go find him. But remember, don't bring that preachy tone you had back in the day, or he'll haul you out to sea and lecture you about salinity." The harbour at dusk is always a living painting, loud, salt-stung, thick with the tang of fish, nets and briny sweat. Boats and trawlers jammed tight, engines thudding, fishermen calling out across the water. In the thick of it, I spotted a familiar figure on the pier, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, shouting instructions to a truck driver. It had to be Coy. As I approached, he swiped sweat from his brow and turned. His eyes were as playful and warm as ever, with deeper crow's feet carved by years of wrestling with the sea. "Lamb, you've got to be kidding me," he bellowed. "I thought you died somewhere, so you're still alive, and you didn't even warn me." He dropped everything and bear-hugged me so hard I nearly stumbled. "What are you doing back? Aren't you a city creature now? I figured you'd be recording birdsong for some shampoo ad." "I'm working, Coy," I laughed, returning the hug. This time, work brought me back to real waves. "Real waves," he echoed, face turning just a shade serious, eyes still lit with mischief. "They're nothing like the waves you record in your soundproof cave, Lamb. You've changed. You don't look like you're about to cry over a poem with no rhyme anymore." We walked the pier, stepping around sodden piles of netting. Coy told me about the new boat, about wrangling crews and fuel prices. "See?" he said, slinging an arm around my shoulders. "Told you. You chase poetry, I chase fish and nets. In the end, we all grow up in our own ways. I've got a boat called Nang To, so my wife won't nag. And you? What do you have to show for these 10 years? I stopped and looked out to sea. Today the water wasn't jeweled orange, only a pensive grey-blue under a clouded sky. "I have stability," I said. "A job my mother is proud of. I no longer worry about what to do after graduation." I reached the smooth road she always wanted for me. Coy studied me. No judgment, only deep understanding. "Stability. Sounds boring, huh, Lamb? Remember how you swore you'd never be boring?" "I did," I admitted. "But sometimes boredom is peace, Coy. It doesn't demand feral creativity or feelings so intense they wreck you." He shook his head. "You're mixing things up. You're not boring. You just put your artist half away for a bit. You use logic and technique to corral what you used to let roam free. Do you still write?" The question pricked like a needle into an old wound. I thought of the bundle tied with seagrass. "I don't write poems anymore," I said, half lying. "I write scripts, ad copy, things with a clear purpose." "Clear purpose," he repeated, mulling the phrase. "Do you still think about Van?" Her name rose over the surf like a familiar note. Even braced, my heart tightened. "I've heard news," I said quietly. "She's doing well in the States." "Doing well," he sighed. "As everyone predicted. She was born to fly high, Lamb. I remember you used to write about her. You called her a misplaced smile. Do you think you disappointed her by not going after her?" I looked at him, and this time I didn't dodge. I needed the honesty of this friend to confirm the truths I'd been telling myself for years. I used to think so. I used to think if I'd been brave enough to run after her, things would be different. But later I realized it wasn't about courage. It was about orbits. Her life was a line shooting upward. Mine needed a circle, an anchor. If I'd followed her, I would have become a weight. Jealousy, resentment, those would have ruined the very love we cherished. "So you chose stability over love?" he asked, not accusing, just precise. "I chose peace for both of us," I said. "I chose to keep her memory perfect, not warped by the quarrels of everyday life. I learned that from her silence after that last afternoon by the sea. Van taught me there are beautiful things you keep, not forced to continue. Coy nodded slowly, looking toward the boat named Nang Tho easing into its berth. Makes sense. I'm different. I didn't have such complicated choices. I had the sea. I stayed and built a life. It's a good one. My wife loves me. I can watch the water every day without anyone calling it boring. You've done well, Coy, I said, and meant it. You didn't let money pressure or a lack of schooling stop you from becoming a good man. You're proof you don't have to be a dreamer musician to live a meaningful life. And you too, Lamb, he answered. You took your sensitivity and built a career in the digital world. You didn't end up a starving poet. You became someone who shapes sound. You didn't abandon yourself, you just changed tools. We stood there a long while, two friends who were 18 once, now two grown men, each taking a different road and finding each other again at the same harbor of memory. Our difference, me who fled town for freedom in work, Coy who stayed for steadiness in tradition, no longer felt like an opposition, but two faces of the same coin called adulthood. Do you ever think, I asked, my voice turning pensive, if back then I'd had the guts to tell Van I'd put aside my foolish romanticism, even without a wide-open future, would she have stayed? Coy shrugged, eyes on the whitecaps breaking far off. I don't know. But I know this. If you tossed your so-called romanticism for her, you would have regretted not chasing your own dream. And if she had stayed for you, she would have regretted passing up the chance her parents staked so much on. Sometimes, love isn't everything. It's the most beautiful part of youth, a catalyst that makes us into who we need to become, even if the price is parting. His words, simple and practical as the waves, gave the clearest shape to my acceptance. Loving Van wasn't a failure. It was a lesson, a gem to keep. I've got to go, Coy, I said, checking my watch. I need to finish the tuning for this blasted resort. I have to make their fake waves sound realer than yours. He laughed loud and long. I'll come listen, Sound Maestro. If it's not real enough, I'll bring you a load of fresh fish to throw into your speakers. We hugged again. No awkwardness, no distance, just the tight bond of friends who weathered the same storm of adolescence. Driving away from the harbor, I felt lighter. I wasn't hunting for romance in the ordinary anymore. My true romance had been preserved intact, tucked away in that bundle tied with seagrass, kept apart from this logical everyday life. I hadn't become a dreamer musician. I'd become a man who knows how to cherish memory and accept that the most beautiful things are often the briefest. I turned on the radio, and this time, I didn't go looking for a simple acoustic track. I put on a complex orchestral piece, a mix I had labored over. It didn't have poetry, but it had structure and depth, and it was proof of my growing up. I smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Back in the city, the rhythm of work at the studio had grown so familiar it was almost numb. 10 years had passed, and I, Lamb, had mastered the art of turning unruly noise into tidy, saleable sound structures. I'd achieved the stability my mother always wanted, but the price was becoming the strict guardian of whatever was left of my soul. The bundle of poems tied with seagrass now rests in a cedar box on top of my wardrobe, high, clean, and entirely apart from the dust and hurry of daily life. A neat partition. Lamb the sound engineer and Lamb the dreamer poet. One sweltering Friday afternoon, while I was fine-tuning frequency bands for an energy drink ad, something as far from the lyrical melodies I once wrote as one could get, my phone rang. It was Lee. She'd kept her creativity and fire, though now she freelanced as a graphic designer, sinking her teeth into independent art projects. "Lamb, can you believe it? I'm in the city." Her voice crackled with the same energy as always, edged now with the thin fatigue of a freelancer's life. I smiled, a rare smile in the studio. Lie, that's unreal. What brings you here? Still chasing reckless ideas? Reckless enough that I ran away from a well-paying gig I despised, she laughed. I'm hunting for a place to get my spark back, and I figured, what better place than wherever Lamb is, the only person I know who can turn the click of a door into a symphony. You still remember that? I asked, a little embarrassed. Of course. That's why I called. I need to see your memory warehouse. Are you free? We have to talk about whether 10 years have turned us into the people we used to hate. We met at a cafe with industrial lines and a cool sterility, the very opposite of Aunt Anne's place by the sea. Lai looked as bold as ever, denim jacket, dark hair tied high, but her eyes had the keen sharpness of someone who had tasted the market's hard weather. Lamb, what are you drinking? She asked without glancing at the menu. Still iced black coffee, but definitely not hand-dripped, right? Right, I said, taking a sip. I need the precision of machines to stay awake. What about you, Lai? I need something with the flavor of rebellion, she winked. A very strong chrysanthemum tea, to remind me I still have a breath of free art in me. We talked about work, about projects big and small, about the pressure to continually prove one's worth in a world that demands novelty on cue. Lai told me about the times she nearly went broke chasing a project too abstract to sell. I told her about wrestling with marketing directors just to keep a sliver of natural sound in a commercial. After a while, Lai stopped and studied me. Be honest, Lamb. Are you okay? Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? I drew a deep breath and looked out the window at skyscrapers angling upward. I'm okay, Lai. I got what I wanted, stability and safety. My mother is pleased. But are you pleased? Lai cut straight to it. You gave up poetry. You gave up the hunger to be a true artist, not a sound technician for corporations. Do you miss Van? She was the one you once swore you'd leave everything for. Van's name surfaced again, like an echo you can't quiet. I do, I admitted. My voice didn't tremble, it carried a strange, settled calm. I miss her very much, Lai, but I've learned that some beautiful things aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to be admired from afar. Van taught me that, without ever saying it. Lai tilted her head, curious. What does that even mean? Did you reach out to her? No, I shook my head. I got an email from her a few years ago. She's thriving. She's walking the trajectory her family charted. And I'm walking mine. And those orbits never crossed again? Lai asked, her voice tinged with regret for a romance lost. We crossed at the loveliest point, I said, feeling the need to make it clear to Lai, who always understood the worth of fleeting moments. Lai, you've always pushed me to think bigger and chase art to the end, but you're also the sharpest among us. Do you see the difference between pursuing passion and living with passion? Lai furrowed her brow. I see the difference as the gap between paying rent and eating instant noodles for a month. I laughed softly. True, but there's another difference. My passion, those naive poems, needed absolute freedom. It needed poverty and a kind of desperate romance to really soar. If I tried to shove it into a steady life, it would suffocate and turn fake. Love with Van was the same. If I had begged her to stay, or chased her into a world I didn't belong to, I would have ruined both things. The love and my own path. I would have become a burden, a failure in her eyes, and I'd regret not letting her fly. So what about that bundle of poems? Lai's voice gentled. What did you do with it? I remember you told Coy you'd keep it forever. This was where I had to be completely honest. I couldn't lie to Lai, who had seen me at both extremes. I put it away, I said slowly, but not as a secret to hide, as a treasure to preserve. I didn't open it for years. Recently, after I went home, I opened it again, and I realized something. Lie. What? That poetry, it isn't my present anymore, it's my past, and its beauty lies exactly in how brief it was. If I keep clinging to it, I won't be able to write anything new. I used my craft to make a new piece, something that reflects my acceptance. I return that memory to its wholeness by not smudging it with my present-day grasping. Lie was quiet for a long time, searching my eyes as if looking for the lamb she used to know. "I get it," she said at last, her voice full of respect. "You grew up in the way you needed to. You didn't become boring, lamb. You became wise. You learned the difference between living in dreams and turning your dreams into the footing of real life." "And you, Lie?" I asked in return. "You're still wrestling with your own recklessness. Are you tired?" She sighed and leaned back. "Tired, yes, but I can't stop. I still believe art can change a life, even if it's just one person's way of seeing. I'm still looking for that big push. Maybe I haven't found my prince yet, the one who could make me stand still at a sunset long enough to know what I truly want." "If you find him," I said, sincere, "treat him with honesty, Lie. Don't let him become a forgotten poem. Let him be a chapter that keeps getting written." Our conversation ended in deep understanding. Lie no longer tried to pull me back into the world of poetry, and I didn't try to talk her into being more practical. We were two friends, two temperaments who once shared naive dreams, now walking different roads, still connected by the respect we have for each other's journey. When I returned to my apartment, I didn't feel lonely. I opened the cedar box and took out the bundle. I didn't read the pages. I only stroked the yellowed paper. They are proof that I once loved fiercely, and that memory will remain the most precious gem kept whole in my heart, apart from the working life I lead. I have not contacted Van, and I never will. She has strode forward on her wide-open road, and I, through this acceptance, have found a steady road of my own, one I've learned to adorn with structured sound instead of ragged, endless verses. That love has completed its work. It helped me become myself, a grown, grateful version. Only a few days after meeting Coy, my resort project entered its final sound tests. The place was lavish, architecture sleek and modern, cold to the touch, utterly at odds with the warmth of the old tile roof houses along the coast. I was in a pitch-dark control room trying to tweak frequencies so the artificial surf would sound as real as possible when the door swung open. It wasn't the project manager. It was a tall man, hair more silver than salt, sharp eyes set in a square face that radiated authority and a chill pragmatism. Mr. Thand, Van's father. He hadn't changed much, except that the sternness he'd always worn was now wrapped in visible success and power. He walked straight toward me without a trace of awkwardness. "You're Lamb, aren't you?" His voice was clear and clipped, steady as a metronome. I shot to my feet, professionalism snapping over me like a coat. "Hello, Mr. Than. I'm Lamb, the sound engineer on this project." He didn't offer a handshake. He stared at my monitors instead, at the mesh of complex waveforms quivering on the screen. "So you're the one behind these sounds," he said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of appraisal. "I'm told you're a sought-after sound engineer in the city." "I try to do my job well, sir," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. He let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Doing your job well, that's what matters. I remember my daughter mentioned you once, a very sensitive boy who liked poetry. I didn't think that boy would find such a stable path." The word stable from him felt like the gentlest kind of put-down, an implied comparison to the international track, the prestige, the business career he had meticulously prepared for Van. "Stability is necessary, sir," I said, choosing to meet his judgment head-on, but in an adult's language. "Poetry is a luxury. It needs a firm foundation to thrive. I built that foundation first." He nodded, a shade more satisfied. Very practical. Van is the same. She's a promising young manager at a major corporation in the States now. Proof that my guidance was correct. She hasn't wasted her youth on frivolities like poems that don't pay. He was talking about Van, but what he was really talking about was the success he'd engineered for her. A small, familiar ache stirred in me, quickly muffled by the casing of professionalism. Van is very smart, I said. She deserves every opportunity she has. Indeed. He stepped closer, as if to test whether there was any weakness left in me. I used to worry when she stayed in that little town for a while, worried she'd get swept up in passing feelings, in relationships with no future. You were a prime example of that temptation, Lamb. I understand your concern, I answered calmly, my hand resting lightly on the console where I could trigger a test at any moment. But I learned to tell the difference between temptation and reverence. I didn't try to hold on to what wasn't mine. I let Van fly the course she needed to take. And you stayed here with fake waves, he said dryly. Not fake waves, sir, I corrected, my voice firming. Creation. I use technique to recreate what I've lost, to turn memory into something of value. That's how I honor what's gone, instead of trying to lock it in a dusty box. I met his gaze. Surprise flickered there. He'd come looking for the softness, the regret of a lovesick boy. But what he found was a professional who had reshaped the value of romance for himself. Interesting, he said at last, his tone less sharp. You've learned to turn sensitivity into a tool for earning. That's something I can appreciate. I'm just doing my job, sir. I'll make sure the resort's sound is flawless, whether the waves are real or manufactured. I pressed a button and the amplified surf rolled through the room, so convincing it gave me goosebumps. He listened for a moment, then nodded. Good. I expect you to do well. Van. She's always had a refined eye. She'll be here for the opening. My heart skipped a beat. Van would be here. After 10 years, she would step into a project I was building, one that stood for his world, the perfect opposite of the poetic world I once believed in. I'll make sure everything is perfect, I said. He left me alone in the dark room, the artificial sea surging around me. The calm I'd spent a decade constructing felt suddenly under siege. Facing Mr. Than as a professional proved I was no longer the boy I used to be. But Van's imminent arrival would be the final test of my acceptance. I thought of what Lai had said. You didn't become boring, you became wise. But would that wisdom be strong enough to face my muse without wavering? I opened a desk drawer. Beneath a layer of technical paperwork, there was a small cedar box. I didn't need to open it. I only had to touch the smooth wood. The gem of memory was still there, perfectly preserved, apart from the din of this $1,000,000 project. I had chosen stability, and that stability now let me face the past as calmly as possible. I was no longer a dreamy musician. I was a maker of sound, and I would use that craft to protect the peace of memory. The days leading up to the resort's grand opening were a long stretch of tension draped in cool professionalism. I turned myself into a perfect sound calibration machine. Every mic, every outdoor speaker, every frequency band had to be under absolute control. The artificial surf I was building had to do more than fool the ear. It needed to soothe people who knew the real sea, people like Coy. I finished installing the surround system that blanketed the entire artificial beach, an engineering feat I was proud of. And yet it left me strangely hollow. I was crafting a perfect copy of nature, a counterfeit measured by software and consoles. On the afternoon before the official opening, when everything was all but done, Coy showed up out of nowhere in my cordoned-off tech zone, far from the resort's glitz. He wore an old striped shirt and faded jeans, utterly out of place among the expensive gear. "Hey, studio musician," Coy called, his voice honest and warm in the hush of the control room. "I'm here to inspect your product. I hear you're trying to mimic the surf we used to swim in a dozen years back." I turned, still holding the sound meter. "Coy, what are you doing here? Aren't you busy with the fleet?" "Busy, sure, but I had to see what my best friend is doing with his stability," he said, eyes sweeping the displays. "Look at you, Lamb. You look successful, but I can see how hard you're bracing yourself. What are you trying to prove, and to whom?" "I'm working, Coy." "And I'm doing it well," I said, a touch defensive. He stepped closer, eyes soft with understanding. "I know you're gearing up for the ceremony. I also heard Van's coming back. Mr. Than wants his daughter to witness the practical success of those who stayed." I set the meter down, tension cinching my chest. "I know I'm ready for it." "Ready? Are you sure? Or are you building a perfect wall of sound so she won't hear your heart hammering?" Coy asked, half philosophy, all coy. "I'm not that kid anymore," I said, holding my ground. "I don't love her the way I used to. That love has been put away. I respect what she chose. I'll greet her as a successful old friend, and then I'll get back to work." "Great," Coy said lightly, peeling a banana from his pocket. "You've learned to package emotion into product. But, Lamb, are you sure you've really paid it off? Or are you just keeping that gem in the cedar box to take out and admire whenever life gets too dull?" "That's gratitude, Coy. The memory is part of me, but it doesn't define me. I'm not clinging to the past to hide from the present. I've accepted that we loved with everything we had, but that love wasn't strong enough to bridge geography and the different orbits of our lives. I let her go, and I accepted staying." Coy nodded, his gaze gentled. "I get it. But don't forget, Lamb, that bundle of poems proves you once lived fiercely. Don't let stability make you forget how you used to feel. If you're only a flawless sound engineer, you'll never be the Lamb I know." "I don't forget," I whispered. "I won't forget. That's why I keep it." "Good, then let her see your growth, not your rigidity. Let her see that even though you didn't follow her, you're living a life worth living. And most importantly," Coy paused, looking me dead in the eye, "if she really is your muse, then no matter the 10 years, no matter how successful she is, she'll still recognize the difference between real waves and the fake ones you make." His words felt like a final briefing, a strong tonic. He wasn't dragging me back to the past. He was reminding me of my core. Opening night. Lights flooded the artificial beach, carving a scene of grandeur and extravagance I'd never seen in our town. Guests in elegant clothes drifted about. The background music, one of my own complex mixes, played steadily. I stood in the control room, nearly invisible, yet commanding the entire soundscape. I wore a black suit, nothing like the white uniform shirt of the old days, and then I saw her. Van walked in beside Mr. Than. No longer the girl in a white dye. She wore an emerald evening gown, elegant, mature. Her long black hair was swept into a refined bun, revealing a stately neck. She was every inch a successful woman, radiant, fully belonging to a world of corporations and million-dollar decisions. Her gaze glided over the hall and paused for a beat on the tech area where I stood. When our eyes met, time stopped. 10 years had passed, but one thing hadn't. The absolute recognition between two people who once shared their deepest secrets. Van smiled, a polite, social smile, but I caught the smallest tremor at the corner of her mouth. She had recognized me. Mr. Than didn't seem to notice. He led her off to meet business partners. I turned back to the console. Everything had to be perfect. This was not the time for feeling. "Lamb, you good?" Coy appeared beside me with a glass of water, an honored guest, representing the local fisherman. "I'm good," I murmured, eyes locked on the screen. "Everything's running to script." "Your script or Mr. Than's?" Coy needled. "The script of technique," I said. Right then, Mr. Than stepped up to the podium. I knew the critical moment was next, the performance of the simulated surf. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang through the system, "let us enjoy the work of our talented technical team who have recreated nature's eternal symphony." I drew a deep breath and ran my fingers across the faders. Here it was, the moment I had prepared for so meticulously. I triggered the wave track. The sound rose, a perfect recording, clean, with absolute depth and reverb, precise to the millisecond, the finest technical simulation. But when I glanced at Van, I saw her brow tighten. She wasn't entirely pleased. Just then, Coy nudged my shoulder. "Lamb, what are you doing? Listen." I listened again to my own sound. It was perfect, but cold. It lacked the improvisation, the surprise of real surf. The sound Coy had meant. I remembered his words. "She will still recognize the difference between real waves and the fake ones. In the wildest moment of my career, I did what no sound engineer is supposed to do. I killed the artificial system." The hall plunged into sudden silence, save for the wind slipping through the rows of faux casuarina trees along the resort's edge. The silence was more frightening than any noise. Guests began to murmur. Mr. Than frowned toward the control room. I flipped on the hidden ambient capture rig I'd installed, a hypersensitive system meant only for checking noise floors, and pushed the fader to the top, and the real sea rushed in. Not a pre-produced track, but the live raw sound, with wind whistling through the tiniest gaps of the resort. It was the true surf, carrying its salt and the unruliness of nature. Mr. Than stormed toward the control room. "Lamb, what the hell are you doing? Turn that noise off." I didn't look at him. I looked at Van. She stood still, eyes wide, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw my muse wholly captivated. She closed her eyes and drew a long breath. "Lamb," she called, voice clear without a mic, cutting straight through the real surf. This is what I remember. That was the peak. Ideal, the real waves, and reality, the opulent resort, collided as hard as they could. I broke Mr. Than's script, and the career-safe script, to answer a wordless call from memory. The hall's sudden silence, torn open by the natural rough and vibrant sound of the sea, created a terrifying pause that lasted longer than any piece of music I had ever produced. Those waves, the sound Van had longed for, had now become an alarm bell for my career. Mr. Thang, a man of plans and absolute control, turned pale with rage, whipping around, his eyes cold as daggers, aimed straight at the sound control room. "Lamb, what the hell are you doing?" His voice rang out not through loudspeakers, yet powerful enough to shake the entire space. His usual sternness had been replaced by the undisguised fury of a man betrayed. "Turn that noise off right now! This is not a wild beach. This is a multi-million-dollar event." I stood firm, my hand on the ambient system's volume fader. I didn't dare turn it off, because if I did, I would have to admit that what I'd just done was only a technical incident, not a statement. "I'm sorry for the disruption, Mr. Than," I replied, my voice quiet but carrying a strange certainty, the kind only facing your greatest fear can bring. "But I can't let this opening ceremony begin with an acoustic lie. Your guests, those who once lived here, deserve to hear the truth." The project manager, a flustered man, rushed into the control room, trying to wedge himself between me and Mr. Than. "Mr. Lamb, what are you doing? We're losing control. Turn it off immediately." "No one touches the system," I ordered. And the unexpected decisiveness made both men freeze. I was no longer the timid schoolboy I used to be. I turned to Van, who stood not far away. Confusion still lingered on her face, but her eyes were fixed on me with deep understanding. "Van?" I called softly, without a mic. "You said you needed an original memory of our youth. This is it. Not what's arranged, but the sound of the place where we were once together. Van took a small step toward me despite her father's scowl. She looked at me, her gaze a wordless thank you. Dad. Her voice rose, gentle but strong enough to soothe the surging tension. Let him speak. He's right. Mr. Than could hardly believe his ears. Van, what are you saying? Do you want to destroy everything I've prepared for you? Not destroy, Dad, Van replied, turning to face him, her calm now carrying an unshakable strength. It's an affirmation. I've lived inside perfect plans for too long. I need to know that there's something here, even if it's the past, that can be truer than all this glamour. She looked back at me again, and this time the smile on her lips was a blend of sorrow and release. Thank you, Lamb. Thank you for not letting me forget the sound of real waves. Van's quiet yet powerful support dealt a decisive blow to Mr. Than's anger. He couldn't berate his daughter in front of hundreds of important guests. He could only grind his teeth and turn to the project manager. Handle this immediately. Get this engineer out of here. I want an official explanation for this technical incident. Mr. Thas ordered, his voice icy. The manager stammered, Yes, Mr. Than. Mr. Lamb, please pack up your things and come with me. I didn't resist. I had achieved what I wanted. I had spoken my truth, even if only through a technical act. I glanced at Koi, who stood with his arms folded, smiling with pride. I told you you're not boring, Koi whispered as I passed. Now go, and don't forget to take that cedar box. It's worth more than this contract. I nodded to Koi, then returned to the control room to switch off the ambient capture system, giving the hall back its frightening silence. But this time the silence was no longer emptiness. It was intentional. I had completed my mission, even at the cost of my career on this project. As I was packing up my personal gear, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. It was Van. She had slipped out of the central area. Lamb, she said softly, her eyes carrying a new resolve. My dad won't let this go. I know, I replied without looking up, continuing to pack. I anticipated that. I'll lose this job. Is it worth it? Van asked, a trace of pain in her voice. It's not about whether it's worth it, I said, finally lifting my head to look straight into her eyes no longer innocent, tempered by the pressure of success. It's because I needed to prove to myself that I can still choose truth over fake perfection. I couldn't protect our love from reality, but I can protect the honesty of the feelings that love gave me. Van stepped closer, and the air between us tightened, not from romance, but from the awareness of boundaries already drawn. Lamb, she whispered, you did what no one here dared to do. You chose the real waves. You chose our memory over my father's contract. I'm only giving that memory the sound it deserves, I said, and now I have to go. You need to return to the ceremony, to your future. Van reached out, but this time not to touch my hand. She handed me a glossy business card with her name and her office address abroad. If you truly want to write new chapters, she said, her voice bearing the formality of a serious offer, get in touch with me. Not as an old lover, but as an artist with a sound engineer. I need people who understand the value of authenticity in this flashy world. I don't want those around me to know only fake waves. I took the card, feeling its stiffness. This wasn't an invitation to get back together, but an acknowledgement of my true value, a value I'd thought I had lost over the past 10 years. I'll keep it, I said, carefully slipping it into my suit pocket, right next to where I had kept the old poetry collection. But I won't contact you right away. I need time to write new sounds. Sounds more worthy to send to a successful woman like you. By then Mr. Than had arrived, his face flushed red. Van, what are you doing here? Go back to your place now. Van looked at her father, then turned back to me one last time, her eyes holding forgiveness and an implicit promise of a connection without bindings in the future. She gave a small nod, then turned and walked away, blending into the crowd of guests, back to the life that had been laid out. I was escorted out of the technical area. As I stepped through the main doors, the artificial surf was switched back on mechanically, but now it sounded truly fake and pitiful. I had lost my job, but I had gotten myself back. A few weeks later, I decided to resign. I didn't need to wait for an official dismissal. I realized that the stability I had pursued for 10 years was, in essence, a cage built from fear. Fear of disappointing my mother, fear of not being good enough. Daring to disrupt that grand opening had given me the courage to break that cage. I returned to my apartment and opened the cedar box. I took out the poetry collection, and this time I didn't just caress it. I sat down beside my old guitar, wiped off the dust, and began to pluck the first notes in many years. The notes were no longer melancholy, self-pitying melodies. They were a blend of the sea's rustic cadence and the precision and complexity of the sound engineering I had learned. I was composing a new piece, a symphony of maturity, where naive romance and harsh reality coexist in harmony. I was no longer a dreamy musician, but I had become a true artist, someone who could turn both worlds, the world of poetry and the world of numbers, into a sound with a soul. I looked at Van's business card on the table. I still hadn't reached out. I needed to complete this work first. I needed to prove that my stability wasn't boredom, but preparation, so that I could enter a more meaningful dialogue with the world, and perhaps one day with her. Painful acceptance had completed its mission. It didn't lead to total ruin. It led to rebirth. Young love didn't save me from reality, but it taught me how to honor the past to build a more truthful future. The gem of memory is still kept, but now I use its light to guide new creations. "What are you doing, Lamb?" I asked myself, the voice in my head now carrying a hint of Coy's timbre, deep and practical. "Are you planning to become a wandering, broke, self-pitying musician like the characters in your old poems?" The answer didn't come from dreaming, it came from the logic I had trained. No, I won't become a self-pitying wreck. I will become a sound engineer who writes music. That's the difference. I won't throw away my skills. I'll use them to nourish the soul. A few days later, Lai showed up. She had heard I'd quit and came right away, her face a mix of worry and excitement. She stepped into the apartment, looked at the professional audio equipment scattered around, then at me sitting on the floor with the old guitar. "You're crazy, Lamb," Lai burst out, almost shouting in surprise. "I heard you got fired from that multi-million-dollar project because of a wave sound. Are you kidding me?" I looked up and smiled. No joke. It was the clearest decision I've ever made. I can't keep assembling sound for other people's dreams, Lai. I need to create my own sound. Lai put her bag down and plopped onto the floor across from me. "But what is your sound? The fake waves you made, or poetry that's been engineered? I need to know because I'm your best friend, the one who used to cheer on your madness." "It's a fusion," I explained, picking a slow D minor DM chord. "It's me acknowledging that romance doesn't have to be poor to survive. It can be preserved by technique, cherished by precision. I'm writing a piece, Lie. A piece about accepting a beautiful ending and about turning loss into a durable source of inspiration." Lai listened intently, the mischief gone from her eyes, replaced by the focus of a true artist. "Then who's the muse of this piece? Still that sleek-haired girl?" "She's the initial inspiration, Lai, the catalyst, but this piece isn't for her, it's for me. It's a declaration that I've learned the lesson from her. Truth matters more than perfection." "And you'll release it?" Lai asked, curiosity plain. "You won't hide it in the cedar box anymore, right?" "I'll release it," I said firmly. But not by sending it to Van. I'll send it to places where art is genuinely valued, not judged only by commercial worth. I'll send it to independent music competitions, places that seek a soul more than technique. Lai clapped hard once. Fantastic. You've finally stepped out of the shadow of material stability. Remember how you used to complain that poetry couldn't feed a hungry belly? And now you have the skills to feed both. Do it, Lamb! We sat there for hours. I played Lai my experimental passages, a mix of rustic guitar and fine layers of electronic sound. With a designer's sensitivity, Lai offered razor-sharp notes on structure and emotion. This section is a bit too technical, Lamb, Lai pointed out. You're trying to prove you're better at software than at heart. Let the romance outweigh the precision a bit. This is a song about a love that has passed, not a user manual for a mixing console. Her comment made me realize a big mistake. In trying to prove I'd grown up and no longer dreamed, I had accidentally turned my music into something cold and rigid, just like the resort I'd left. You're right, I admitted, ashamed. I focused too hard on proving I'm not a dreamer anymore, and forgot that the dreaming is what creates my music. A few weeks later, Coy showed up again, this time at my door, empty-handed, but bringing his familiar racket. I came to check whether you're surviving, Coy said, stepping into the apartment. He looked around, the humor fading from his face when he saw the guitar neatly on its stand, no longer covered in dust. You're not working for those rich guys anymore, Coy asked, staring at me, T-shirt and jeans, far more relaxed than the last time. I quit, I said. I'm spending time on something that truly means something to me. Meaningful how? Coy asked. He didn't use Lai's flowery words, he went straight to the core, to compose a complete piece. About acceptance, about letting go of beautiful things that can't be kept. Coy walked up to the guitar and plucked a string. So have you written about Van yet? I've written about the feeling when she left, I said. But it's not a sad love song, Coy. It's a piece about gratitude. I learned from her that maturity sometimes requires accepting that two people who love each other with everything can still go in different directions without either being wrong. Sounds profound, Coy murmured. He looked at me with pride. You haven't gone numb, Lamb. You've just learned to protect your heart with a sturdier shell. I learned that from you, I said, sincere. You never try to be someone else. You live with the sea, accept its harshness, and still keep your humor. You're the most practical of us. I just don't have time to daydream, Coy laughed. I've got a fleet to worry about. But I'm happy for you. You found your voice without becoming a romantically tragic loser. Coy then spent the whole afternoon listening to my rough track. He didn't understand all the complex sound structures, but he understood the emotion. The ending, Coy pointed to the piece's climax, where I tried to weave technical precision into the freedom of real waves. This part sounds very real. It's not fake surf anymore. It's the waves I hear every morning when I head out. It has both anger and peace. That's the part I had to fight for the most, I confessed. I had to allow myself to be imperfect there. Validation from Coy, the representative of our small town's harsh reality, was worth more than any praise from the city art crowd. I'd found balance. This piece wasn't just about Van. It was about who Lamb had become after losing Van. After finishing the piece, I decided to send it out. I didn't send it to Van. I sent it to an international independent music competition, a place where I knew that if it succeeded, it would be judged on pure artistic value, untouched by personal ties. A few months later, I received a notice. My piece, titled Bi Ke Da Ku I Kung, won first prize in the environmental sound composition category. The award wasn't a mountain of money, it was recognition. I called Lai first. I won, Lai, I said, my voice shaking with emotion, almost in tears. I knew it, Lai squealed on the other end. I told you. You harmonized romance and precision. Now you can tell the world who you are with confidence. You don't need anyone else's reputation to be recognized anymore. I did it, I whispered, looking at the cedar box. I used that memory as a foundation, but I wrote the new melody myself. Right after that, I opened my email. There was a new message from Van. I hadn't opened it during the composing process, saving it as a final reward. This time, she didn't write in professional English. She wrote in Vietnamese, with a much more intimate tone. Lam, I just received the announcement about your award. I searched for it. I listened to the piece. It's not just a piece of music. It's the answer to all the questions I've carried for 10 years. The way you combined technical precision with the sound of real surf at the end. It made me realize you never abandoned romance. You just learned how to protect it. I've succeeded in business, Lam. I achieved everything my father wanted. But there are nights when everything is too perfect, too controlled, that I miss the thrill of receiving one of your handwritten letters, the feeling of not knowing what would happen next. You kept my business card, and now I want you to use it. Lam, I'm no longer the girl who needs an original memory to carry. I have new experiences, new scars. But your music, it shows me that some beautiful things can still exist without being bound by a relationship. It's the freedom we searched for, but by a different road. I want to invite you to the US, not as an ex-lover, but as a collaborator. I'm setting up a small arts fund dedicated to supporting young artists who dare to blend tradition and modernity. Your music is exactly the spirit the fund needs. Lam, you didn't have to follow me to succeed. You created your own path, one that I, once so pragmatic, now admire deeply. Keep that gem of memory, but use its light to illuminate the future. Van, I finished reading, and this time I truly smiled. I no longer felt bitterness or regret. I had received recognition for my talent, and I had received acceptance from the muse of my past. That love didn't end in a fairy tale, but it led to true maturity. I looked at the business card and the poetry collection. I wouldn't throw the poems away, but I would no longer need to open them to look for inspiration. The memory had become part of my blood, a solid foundation. I turned back to the guitar and began to play the award-winning piece again. This time, I wasn't trying to balance technique and emotion. I simply played, letting the sound flow freely. A sound that carried the breath of the home sea and the sharpness of the modern world. Van's business card, now replaced by an official email and a potential collaboration contract, sat quietly beside the poetry collection bound with jute twine. I didn't rush to reply. Maturity, I realized, is not only the ability to face the truth, but also the ability to weigh things carefully before making a decision that could once again change the trajectory of a life. I had learned that romantic haste leads only to hollow promises, while deliberate slowness lays solid foundations. I decided to consult my two closest friends, the two poles that had kept me balanced for the past 10 years. Luai, who represents boundless artistic ambition, and Koi, who represents the undeniable reality of home. Lai was the first I called. She was busy designing packaging for a rising craft coffee brand. When I presented the chance to collaborate with Van's Arts Fund, she nearly jumped out of her chair. The US! Lam, are you crazy if you turn this down? Lai asked, her voice high, full of excitement and a touch of healthy envy. You'll get to work with international artists, access funding a lone artist like me only dreams of, and more importantly, you'll be working with Van, your former muse. This is your chance to prove you're not just a great sound engineer, but an artist with vision. But Lai, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, you know, why I walked away from that resort project. I don't want to be swept into the vortex of fake glamour. And I'm afraid that even if Van has changed, her world is still one of perfect plans, where truth is easily distorted into a PR strategy. Lai sighed, the sound carrying a hint of disappointment. Lamb, are you still afraid of Mr. Thun's shadow? You've already won an award. You have your own name now. You don't need anyone's permission to create any more. If you refuse this invitation, you're closing the biggest door of your career with your own hands just because of that innocent memory. I'm not refusing the opportunity, I explained, looking at the worn poetry collection on the table. I'm defining its limits. I've written Van a letter, but I haven't sent it. I need to make it clear I'll come as a professional collaborator, not as an ex-lover seeking redemption. I won't let any personal relationship affect the value of my art anymore. Then what are you going to say to her? Lai asked, her voice shifting into analysis mode. I'll say, I appreciate your recognition of my work. I accept the invitation to collaborate, but the prerequisite is that every project I join must prioritize the authenticity of sound over any commercial factor, and I will never use fake waves again. Lai was silent for a long moment, then burst out laughing. Perfect! That's the Lamb I know. You've turned romance into a working principle. You're no longer the dreamy boy who only writes poems. You're a producer with principles. I support you 100%. No, 1,000%. After Lai's encouragement, I knew I needed more practical counsel. Advice not obscured by the glitter of creativity. I called Koi. Koi picked up immediately, his voice noisy, with the sound of sea wind and the hum of machinery in the background. Lamb, what's up? I'm busy loading cargo onto the Muse. I've got a big opportunity, Koi. Going to the US, working with Van, what do you think? Koi was silent for a moment, the sea wind louder over the line. The US, huh? Sounds far. You're not going to forget this salty smell, are you? I won't forget, I said firmly. I've learned how to carry it with me. I'll use that award as proof that I've built a solid foundation on my own. I'm no longer a dreamer who needs someone to rescue him. Good, Koi replied, sounding satisfied. But Lamb, remember, there's no real sea there. You'll be living in high-rises and closed offices. Can you stand that? I lived 10 years in a suffocating apartment, Koi. I can handle it, I said. More importantly, I need to go to broaden the range of my sound. I need to understand what Van hears every day, so my music isn't confined to the surf of this small town. Fair point, Koi admitted. But remember, if you get homesick, if you miss the feel of bare feet on wet sand, call me. I'll send you some real seawater, or at least a recording of the waves I'll make on my old phone. At least it'll be real. I'll remember, I said. And Koi, I want to ask you a small favor. What? When I go, I want you to look after that poetry collection. Don't let it get damp or chewed by mice. It's my most important keepsake. Koi laughed loudly, the sound echoing like the old days. Who do you think I am? I'm your best friend. Don't worry, I'll put it in the safe on the Muse, the safest spot, right next to my old sea chart. I swear, not a drop of artificial seawater will harm it. After talking with Lai and Koi, I felt all doubt dissolve. I had the backing of the friends who embody the two extremes of my life, artistic rebellion and enduring practicality. Now I was ready to write back to Van, not as the Lamb of the past, but as the Lamb of the present, an artist who has learned to honor both ideals and reality. I sat down at my desk, with the guitar and the poetry collection beside me. I didn't open the poems. I opened my email. I wrote a long, flowing letter, no longer filled with awkward, airy phrases, but carrying a deeper sincerity. Van, thank you for your letter. I listened to the track you sent, a very delicate piece of sound, but I hope you understand that technical perfection cannot replace the truth of emotion. I accept your invitation to collaborate. I will come to the US, not to seek a romance that is ended, but to seek an artistic space where I can develop my vision. I will bring the experience of a sound engineer and the sensitivity you awakened in me. I want to make one thing clear. I will never try to cling to old memories. The poetry collection bound with jute twine has been kept like a gem, a relic of innocence that has completed its mission. It is no longer a burden or a primary source of inspiration, but a foundation. I have learned that I don't need to live inside poetry to create art. I will come to work with you in building an arts fund that upholds authenticity. I will ensure that every project under your fund's name never uses artificial sound to deceive the public. I will bring you technical precision, but in return, I need the freedom to keep my music alive with the soul. I have also left my old job. I am preparing for a new beginning. I will no longer be a man afraid of change. Let's meet there, Van. Not as former lovers, but as two grown artists, ready to create something more meaningful than a broken first love. See you at the new horizon. Lam. I hit send. Without a moment's hesitation. For the first time in 10 years, I felt I was actively writing my future, instead of merely reacting to whatever life threw at me. When I stood and looked out the window, the city sky was still grey, but inside me, everything had cleared. I was no longer bound by false stability, and I was no longer haunted by a romance with no exit. The gem of memory had been put in its rightful place, and now I was ready to craft new melodies, melodies worthy of both our maturity. Sending the last letter to Van felt like closing a heavy door, but instead of hearing the hopeless slam of a lock, I heard the crisp click of a latch being released. I was no longer bound by waiting for a reply, or by the torment of unsaid things. I had allowed myself to fly on the very wings I once thought I had lost. In the days that followed, I took time to say goodbye to those who had witnessed my innocent first love. My new career, though not yet officially begun, gave me the freedom to arrange everything to my own rhythm. I returned to Aunt Anne's shop one last time. It was quieter. Tourist season had passed, and the lively laughter of students had given way to the stillness of fishermen preparing for the big fishing season. Aunt Anne sat knitting, her eyes as gentle as ever. She didn't ask much about the new job or about Van. She just looked at me, as if reading the unwritten pages of my life. Lamb, Aunt Anne spoke, her voice warm as the cup of hot tea in my hand. You're leaving, aren't you? Going very far? Yes, Aunt Anne, I'm going to the US to work with Van on her arts fund. Aunt Anne smiled in relief. Good. You're no longer the child who only clung to a guitar and complained about life's unfairness. You found a way to turn your dreams into tools for survival. That's what I've wished for you most. I'm grateful that you always listened to my awkward verses, I said, feeling light. I'll never forget the afternoons sitting here, telling you the things I didn't dare say to my mother. Aunt Anne set down her needles. Those lines were never awkward, Lamb. They were seeds. Seeds need time to sprout, and sometimes they must be sown in a different patch of soil to bloom. That girl from back then, she was the strong wind that carried your seeds far. I won't forget what you've taught me, I said. Just then the shop door opened with a familiar creak, and Coy came in, sweaty, holding something carefully wrapped in an old cloth. Hello, Auntie. I just finished loading the last nets for the long trip. I had to come say goodbye to my best friend before he turns into a foreigner. Coy laughed loudly, but his eyes were very serious when he looked at me. Coy came over, not hugging me like last time, but placing a firm hand on my shoulder. Studio musician, you're finally leaving this little town. I kept my promise. He unfolded the cloth. Inside was the poetry collection, bound with jute twine. I'll put it in the safe on the Muse, as promised, Coy said proudly. It's better protected than any of my own possessions. Not a drop of seawater gets in. Want to open it one last time? I shook my head. No need, Coy. I know it by heart. You keep it. Consider it a keepsake for all of us. If your wife ever nags you too much, open it and read a poem. It might help you see there's still more to your life than dealing with market prices. Coy laughed heartily, the seriousness melting away. All right, I'll read it to my wife. I'll tell her it's the oath of a man who once loved a muse and now has to go find a new source of inspiration. Aunt Anne smiled and poured more tea for Coy. My boys, wherever you go, whatever you do, don't forget the smell of this homeland, the scent of honesty, of salt. I'll never forget, Aunt Anne, I replied. I'll carry this scent around the world. Saying goodbye to my mother was the hardest part. Mrs. Lan already knew I had quit and was preparing to go to the US. She didn't cry loudly like I'd imagined. Instead, she grew frighteningly quiet. I went home. The old tiled house was unchanged, save for a few new moss stains on the wall. Mrs. Lan was sitting at the kitchen table, not in her office Audai, but in her familiar ba-ba blouse, carefully picking up grains of rice spilled on the floor. "Mom," I called softly. Mrs. Lan looked up, her small eyes showing fatigue and helplessness. "So you've decided? There's nothing more to say." "Mom, I've told you so many times," I went to her and knelt beside her. "I can't keep living inside the mold you drew for me. It's stable, but it kills me. It kills the artist in me." "How can an artist make a living, Lamb?" Mrs. Lan choked up. "I worked so hard so you wouldn't have to taste the bitterness of poverty. Do you know how terrible that feels? I just want you to have a safe life, without worrying about frivolous things." "I understand your sacrifice," I said, my voice trembling with emotion, "and I'm so grateful. But Mom, I've proven I'm not a fanciful dreamer. I've won an award. I have skills. I can make a living through art, by creating sound. I don't need to be a boring pedagogy teacher to have stability." Mrs. Lan looked at me, her eyes seeming to try to grasp the concept of an international music award I had tried to explain in a previous phone call. She didn't understand art, but she understood recognition. You'll really be all right?" Mrs. Lan asked weakly. "Will you eat properly, in that strange place, without me to care for you?" "I'll be fine," I said, holding her wrinkled hand. "I've learned to take care of myself, and Mom, I'm not going to run away from you, but to become the best version of myself. When I succeed, I'll be able to take care of you better than any stable job you could find for me here." Mrs. Lan stared at me, then slowly nodded. It wasn't an eager acceptance, but a surrender to an unchangeable reality, cushioned by deep love. "Then go," she said, her voice hoarse. "But remember to call me often. Don't make me worry like when you used to cling to that guitar." "I will," I promised. "I'll call and tell you about the new sounds I create." I hugged my mother tight, taking in her thinness and familiar scent. It was my last embrace of traditional bonds, an embrace full of gratitude and release. On the day I left, no one saw me off at the airport except a taxi. I didn't want to stage a mawkish scene, but before heading to the airport, I made a short trip to the old high school. The schoolyard still had the flamboyant tree, though the season of blazing red flowers had passed. I stepped into the classroom. Everything was the same, old desks carved all over, the blackboard dusted with chalk. I found my desk, where Van and I once sat side by side. I placed my hand on the wooden surface where I had written my first lines about her. I left no message. I didn't need to leave a mark. Memory was etched deeper than any pencil stroke. I went back to the beach one last time, standing there for just a few minutes. The waves still crashed against the shore, Not amplified sound, not fake surf. It was the real sea, wild and free. I smiled. I was no longer the dreamy musician, and Van was no longer my muse. But thanks to that muse, I had learned how to become a true artist, one who knows how to cherish what's lost in order to build something new. I turned my back on the sea, got into the car, and headed toward a new horizon, where there would be collaboration contracts, art projects, and perhaps a more honest dialogue with Van. The gem of memory had been stored safely, and now I was ready to create new melodies, melodies worthy of this maturity. The airplane door slammed shut, carrying with it the roar of jet engines that tore through the stillness I'd been accustomed to for 18 years. When I stepped into the bustling international airport, the first shock wasn't the difference in language, but the difference in sound. This city had no murmur of waves, no hawkers calling the morning catch. It was a chaotic symphony of car horns, the hiss of pneumatic brakes, and millions of hurried conversations in English, all turned up to the maximum. I took a taxi to the small apartment Van had arranged for me near the art centre. It was clean, modern, and utterly sterile in terms of emotion. No traces of moss, no smell of old paper or sea salt. I opened my suitcase, and the first thing I did wasn't sort my clothes but look for the cedar box. I set it neatly on the minimalist desk under the cold white LED light. The gem of memory had been moved out from beneath an old bed. Now it lay under the light of a new world, a clear separation between a preserved past and a present demanding reinvention. My work began immediately. The Arts Fund Van was building needed a distinct sonic identity, something both global and imbued with the soul she had once longed to find in me. My primary mentor was Professor Alistair Reid, a legendary sound designer in the contemporary art world. He embodied rigor and an uncompromising stance against fakery. Alistair didn't care about my romantic past. He only cared about my ability to create real things with artificial tools. Our first meeting took place in the Fund's largest recording studio, an absolutely soundproof space where even the beating of your heart could be captured. "Lam," Alistair began, his voice deep with a classic British timbre, "I've listened to your award-winning piece, Bi Keraku Ikyung, The Last Rock Breakwater. Very interesting. The blend of raw waves and tightly controlled electronic layers. You did that well, but I want to ask, are you sure you're making art, or are you just copying an old experience?" I took a deep breath, trying to reclaim the composure I'd trained over 10 years. "Professor Reid, I believe all great art stems from authentic experience. I'm using that experience as a language, but my tools are modern technique. I'm not copying, I'm reinterpreting." Alistair raised an eyebrow, a gesture that made him look like a strict professor in a film. Reinterpretation, a very pretty word, but here we don't pay for pretty rephrasings, we pay for effectiveness. Ms. Van wants a sonic identity that expresses the intersection between Eastern tradition and Western avant-garde. Do you understand me? "I understand," I replied. "She wants balance between the old and the new, like the way I've tried to balance poetry and accounting." Alistair studied me for a long moment. "You're talking about Ms. Van." "Ah, she's an intelligent woman, very practical. She told me you're the only one who can grasp the complexity of her vision, a vision that wants to keep the essence while reaching out to the world. You look like a dreamer, but you have the mind of an engineer. That's a rare combination." "I used to be a dreamer," I admitted, my voice dropping a little. "But that dream taught me how to live in reality." "What is reality, Lam?" Alistair asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Money? Career? Or that you've learned to package emotion into a product that can be sold?" "Reality is the freedom to choose," I answered, feeling I had to defend not just my work but my past. "Without stability, I can't pursue art sustainably. I don't want to be a starving artist struggling to survive. I want the tools to create work that has impact." "Very logical," Alistair nodded. "But don't let that logic kill your sensitivity. I want to hear you create the fun sound. It must be the sound of intersection, not compromise. Show me the difference between the real waves you heard back home and the perfect waves you make here. And I want you to do it within a week." The challenge was like a strong stimulant. I plunged into work, turning the studio into my home. I no longer thought of Van as a lost muse, but as a professional partner placing high expectations on me. During the process, I was constantly facing questions about inspiration. One afternoon, while I was trying to balance an Eastern classical melody with a modern electronic rhythm, a young assistant at the fund named Sarah walked in. "Mr. Lamb, this mix sounds great, but it's missing a bit of gentleness," Sarah remarked, a touch hesitant. "It's too forceful, too confident. Miss Van says she wants something more delicate, like an invitation rather than a declaration." "Confidence is necessary when we're building something new," I replied, a little annoyed at the interference in my frequency band. "This is the sound of maturity, Sarah. It can't be naive." "But Miss Van once said," Sarah continued, apparently well briefed, "that the most beautiful things are often the most subtle, the things you have to listen very closely to notice." Her words jolted me. That was exactly how Van used to describe my poems. "She said that?" I asked, almost a whisper. "Yes. She said that sometimes truth lies in the smallest details, the things people don't want others to see." I thanked Sarah and asked her to step out. I closed the studio door. I stared at the screen with its crisp waveforms. I realized that even though Van had matured, even though she had become a sharp manager, the core subtlety and her appreciation for small things were still there. She wasn't asking me to go back to poetry. She was asking me to bring the soul of poetry into this new work. I went back to my old guitar and took it off the stand. I didn't play complex chords, just plucked a simple homespun phrase, a melody I wrote for Van right after the first time she sat beside me, the poem about the smile that fell. I recorded that phrase with the best mic in the studio. Then I began the process of reinterpretation. I didn't make it too loud, didn't make it too technical. I only added a very thin background layer, almost imperceptible, the soft creak of an old wooden chair. When I played back the new mix, it was perfect. It was a fusion of the rustic past and the precision of the present. It was an invitation, not a proclamation. After a week of non-stop work, I sent the final demo to Van. I didn't call or text. I just sent it and waited. 2 days later, as I was tidying a mess of cables, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. "Hello?" I picked up, my professional tone already set. "Lamb," Van's voice came through, gentle, but without the chilly distance of our first email exchange. "Your mix, it's truly wonderful." "Thank you," I replied, trying to steady my heartbeat. "I tried to put into it the authenticity you wanted." "I've listened to it many times," Van said, "especially the climax. That little creak. I almost cried right there in the office. How could you put that into a commercial mix without making it feel ridiculous?" "It's a balance," I explained. "It's a small detail, a subtle crack in a perfect wall, a reminder that everything has an imperfect beginning, and that doesn't diminish its value." "Lamb," Van said, her voice tinged with emotion, "you've truly changed. You've found a way to honor the past without living in it." "And you too, Van," I replied. "You haven't let success make you forget the value of truth. You recognize that small detail, even while running an entire arts fund." We were silent for a moment, the geographic distance seeming to dissolve in this deep understanding. This wasn't flirting, but respect between two people who had once shared a piece of their souls. "So when will you come meet the executive board in person?" Van asked. We need to discuss the roadmap ahead. Next week, I said. I've wrapped things up here. I'll come and present a detailed plan for building the fund's sonic identity. Excellent, Van said, her voice turning more serious and authoritative. Lamb, you know this is a very competitive environment. I need absolute precision from you. Don't let any personal feelings affect the work. Don't worry, I promised. Our old relationship has been carefully stored away. I won't let it affect the job. I'll be your most professional partner. Wonderful, Van replied. See you at the office. And Lamb. Yes. Thank you for never forgetting how to create the sound of truth. I hung up, feeling a nameless relief. I was ready to face Van, not to go back but to build something new together, something built on a foundation of truth, not the clumsy promises of adolescence. The gem of memory was still there, but now its light was being used to illuminate a promising future of collaboration. After sending my professional commitment to Van, I felt a new kind of energy, not the fervor of youth, but the fierce focus of a craftsman finishing his masterpiece. I returned to the studio not to create cold commercial sounds, but to fulfill a promise to myself and to Van, to make a sound with a soul, a perfect synthesis between the raw truth of memory and the finesse of mature technique. I set the cedar box on the control desk as a reminder of the source of inspiration. I didn't open it, but I knew what was inside, the awkward verses, the unnamed emotions. I needed to turn those feelings into a new language, one that both Van and I could understand without reverting to our old roles. I began with the ocean recording Coy had sent me, a raw, unprocessed file that sounded like the sea growling as it wrestled the breakwater. It held anger, chaos, and eternity. I called this audio file the raw material. I spent the first 3 days just cleaning it, not by removing noise, but by isolating it. I used complex digital filters to separate each frequency, each layer of sound, like an archaeologist carefully brushing away the dust of time from a precious artifact. This isn't a technical task, I muttered to myself, in the near-silent room. This is decoding an emotional cipher. Once I had the basic wave layers under control, I began the synthesis. I took out my old guitar, and this time I didn't play unfinished chords. I played melodies I had written in the lonely years after Van left, melodies tinged with sadness, yet structured, precise. I recorded them, then used technique to make the guitar sound as if it were coming from an old radio, hazy like a memory striving to echo back from far away. And then came the hardest part, weaving in the small detail. I needed the creak of the wooden chair. I couldn't reuse the old sound, it was too rough. I spent an entire evening recreating it. I used a different, heavier wooden chair and an ultra-sensitive recording setup to capture a creak with just the right resonance and frequency decay, turning it into a delicate sigh placed almost imperceptibly within the mix. When I finished the first test mix, I called Lai. She was the only one who could tell me whether I was drifting too far toward technique. Lai, listen to this, I said, sending the file over. It's a special demo for Van. I need you to tell me, does it still keep its soul? Just a few minutes later, Lai called back, her voice full of astonishment. Lamb, what on earth is this? It's not a song, it's a perfectly packaged feeling. I hear the waves, but they don't make me feel overwhelmed. I hear the guitar, but it doesn't make me sad. And that tiny sigh on the third beat, what is that? That's the old chair, I said, feeling a sincere pride. I had to redo it hundreds of times, so it was just loud enough to be recognized, but not enough to bother anyone. You're crazy, Lamb, Lai laughed, her laughter echoing down the line. You've turned naivety into subtlety. You've found a way to keep the crack without shattering the whole picture. Van's going to go crazy for it. I hope not out of anger, I said. I hope she sees the respect I have for her, even though we're no longer together. A few days later, I received a confirmation email from Van. Come to the office at 4 p.m. I want to hear that demo in our perfectly sound-isolated environment. I arrived at Van's office on time. She was ready. The space was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. She wasn't at her desk but seated on a long sofa, her eyes fixed on the large computer screen. "Lamb, you're here," Van greeted me, her voice composed. "I've turned off all other audio systems. I want to hear this piece without any interference." "I'm ready," I said, stepping up to the console, feeling at home even in a place that was completely unfamiliar. This piece is titled Duvtcaago, Traces of Wind. It's a synthesis of what we've shared. "I'm ready to listen," Van replied. I pressed play. The sound began with an almost absolute silence. Then a single guitar note rang out, long and rustic, old. It faded, yielding to the raw, noisy sea, like an emotional outburst. Van closed her eyes. She didn't frown. She simply tilted her head to listen. Then, as the waves reached their peak, they were wrapped in a finely processed orchestral layer, melodic, smooth, as if my awkward verses had been arranged by a master musician. And then, right on the third beat, a tiny sound, almost a breath, a creak from the old chair. The piece ended with the sea dissolving, leaving only the single guitar note lingering and then vanishing, returning to absolute silence. We sat in silence for a long minute. The soundproof room made that silence heavier and more meaningful than any words. Van opened her eyes. No tears fell, but her gaze brimmed with emotions I hadn't seen in 10 years. "Lamb," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "you did it. You turned chaos into structure, and structure into feeling." "That's what I've learned over the past 10 years, I said, feeling a spreading ease. "I've used precision to protect truth." "That creak," Van said, bringing a hand to her mouth as if stifling a sob. "What is it?" "It's almost invisible, yet it's the one thing that made me realize this is the sound of us." "It's the sigh of acceptance," I explained, "a reminder that no matter how hard we try to make things perfect, there are always imperfect moments, the tiny cracks that form the essence of everything. You once said, truth lies in the smallest details that people don't want others to see. That creak is my confession that I was once very afraid and that I still cherish that moment of fear." Van nodded rapidly, her eyes glassy but dry. "I understand. It's not clinging. It's acknowledgement. It's the maturity of both of us." "We're not dreamy kids anymore, Van," I said, my voice calm. "We're builders. I respect your success, and I hope you respect my choice." "I do," Van replied, standing and circling the conference table to face me. She didn't hug me. She stood before me with a gaze full of sincere admiration. "Lamb, I was wrong to think stability is boring. Your stability gave you the strength to create this art, the kind of art the world needs. And you were wrong to think only the wide-open road is the right one," I said. "Your hunger for experience taught me that sometimes we have to step away from the familiar to discover its true value." We stood there. No intimate touch, no schoolyard romance, only an acknowledgement of the paths we had taken and a deep respect for the road ahead. "So, we're going to work together?" Van asked, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a completely professional gesture that nonetheless carried meaning. "We're going to work together," I affirmed. "I'll bring truth, and you'll bring a global vision. We'll create a sound the whole world has to listen to, not because it's loud, but because it contains truth." "Wonderful," Van smiled, her smile now a blend of the sharp businesswoman and the gentle girl from long ago. "Welcome to the team, Lamb. Let's start building." I looked at the cedar box on the table. The gem of memory had been perfectly preserved. It had completed its mission, It had catalyzed my growth, and now it was the foundation on which I would build the future. That love did not end in a shared destiny, but it led to an enduring collaboration, built on truth and mutual respect. The weeks after that fateful meeting passed in a state of intense focus, a strange fusion of an engineer's discipline and an artist's sensitivity. I had begun the funds work, and this new environment, however cold and demanding, turned out to be the most fertile ground for my creativity. I no longer fought the pressure to be stable. I fought the pressure to create works with value beyond time. My studio at the Fund was no longer just a space for adjusting frequencies. It had become a laboratory where I researched emotional resonance. The cedar box now sat on a gleaming metal shelf, right beside screens running complex acoustic analysis software. I didn't need to open it to remember, because every sound I made was a reinterpretation of the emotions recorded inside it. The first project Van and Professor Alistair assigned me was a series of sound installations for an international exhibition titled Heritage and the Future. Van wanted it to be a dialogue between the ancient sounds of fading cultures and the sounds of the digital age. In a tense team meeting, Alistair Reed, wearing his usual severe look, was criticizing a mix I had spent the whole night perfecting. "Lamb," Alistair said, his voice cutting. "This mix is too clean. It sounds like a soundtrack for a luxury car commercial. We're talking about heritage, about the scars of history. I need collision." I tried to contain the irritation of someone whose effort had just been torn apart. "Professor Reed, I used samples recorded at archaeological sites and processed them to remove modern electromagnetic noise. I wanted to make sure the audience felt the stillness of heritage, not the bustle of a tourist town." Alistair tapped a pencil on the table. "The stillness you've created sounds like absence, Lamb. It has no weight, no sorrow." At that moment, Van stepped in. Seated at the head of the table, her eyes were sharp, but her voice was composed. "Professor, I think Lamb is on the right track. The stillness he's creating is a form of respect for sacred space. But Lamb," she turned to me, her gaze softening a little, "I agree with the professor about the sorrow. You've done a great job recreating sound, but you're missing the meaningful randomness we discussed." I was surprised. Van remembered our private conversation about that gentle sigh. "Meaningful randomness?" I asked. "What do you mean in this context?" Van leaned forward. "I want you to put in something no one can predict. A sound that arrives suddenly, but doesn't break the overall structure. An unexpected evocation of a deeply personal moment. You can do that, Lamb, because you're the only one on this team who can turn a personal feeling into a sonic structure that can be sold." Alistair gave Van a puzzled look. "Miss Van, are you talking about inserting personal emotion into an academic project?" "I'm talking about putting humanity into technique, Professor," Van replied, her eyes never leaving me. "Lamb understands this better than anyone. Lamb, do you remember the real C, what you used to stand up to my father?" A current shot down my spine. She was publicly recalling the past, not to rekindle romance, but as proof of my artistic capability. "I remember it clearly," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "It wasn't perfect, it was rough, but it was the truth, and that truth had a resonant frequency stronger than any processed sound." "Exactly," Van emphasized. "I want you to bring that truth into this mix, but not the noisy waves. I want you to find the resonant frequency of loss, of acceptance. Find that sound and place it where people only hear it when they're truly listening." After a beat of silence, Alistair smiled faintly. "I see. You're asking him to add a deliberate crack, a precisely measured imperfection. Lamb, can you do that?" I looked at Van and saw absolute faith in my ability in her eyes. It was the faith I had once longed to receive from those closest to me, and now it came from a professional partner. "Not only can I do it," I said, "I'll make it the focal point of the entire exhibition. I'll put in a sound that only those who once loved innocently will recognize." In the days that followed, Van and I worked more closely than ever, but strictly within professional bounds. We exchanged hundreds of emails about acoustic structures, about differences between frequency bands, and about how to convey emotion without words. One late evening, with the office deserted, I was testing a new layer, a sound simulating wind whistling through the gaps of an old house. I was trying to find the perfect intensity so it wouldn't be mistaken for noise. Van walked in carrying 2 iced black coffees, no milk, no sugar. She set one down on my desk. "Still working through the night?" she asked, tired yet sharp. "Only when I find an interesting acoustic problem," I said, taking a sip. "This tastes better than the coffee my mother makes, but it doesn't have the scent of sacrifice." Van sat in the chair opposite. "Don't bring up your mother again, Lamb. I know that's hard for you, but you've done well. Your mother is proud of you even if she can't be present in the way you wish." "She accepted my adventure," I said. "And now I'm proving that adventure can create something of artistic value." "As for the past," Van said, switching topics decisively, "Lamb, I want to ask you something frankly, as someone who was once very close to you." "Go ahead, Van. Do you regret it? Not going with me when I left? Not asking me to stay? Choosing the safe path and staying behind?" I looked at her, the glow from the monitor highlighting the mature, resolute lines of her face. "Van, if I had gone with you, I wouldn't have this." I pointed to the expensive audio gear. "I wouldn't have the freedom to create traces of wind, nor would I have won the award. I'd just be an ex clinging to your halo. I'd become the burden you were afraid to carry." "And if I had chosen to stay?" Van countered, a question she'd kept hidden for 10 years. "If you had stayed," I answered, more sincere than ever, "you would have resented me. You would have resented that small town for holding you back. You would have resented me for not being ambitious enough to pull you along. You wouldn't be the intelligent, decisive woman you are today." Van closed her eyes. "That's right. I had to leave, and you had to stay to find your value. We did the right thing, Lamb. We chose maturity over compromise." "That's right," I affirmed, "and that's why I don't need to open that poetry notebook anymore. Those feelings have been transformed. They're no longer a burden, they're a drive." Van smiled. "Then let's focus on the project. I need you to put in a sound that evokes home but is global. Think of it as building a bridge between 2 worlds, not a wall." "I understand," I said. "I'll use the sound's coy scent, real waves, real wind. But I'll process them with the most advanced techniques, so they resonate with listeners anywhere in the world, whether they're in New York or London." We kept working. Our discussions were no longer a clash between idealism and reality, but a collaboration between 2 people with the same goal: to create the truest art with the most powerful tools. The exhibition space was designed like a maze of light and shadow, a world stage to challenge the viewer's perception. I, Lamb, was now the one conducting the soul of this space. The fun's culminating project, the one Van and I built together, titled Resonant Memories, demanded a perfect union between the precision of the digital and the imperfections of human memory. I was in the central control room, a small chamber completely isolated from the main exhibition. The only light was the gentle blue glow of the monitors, reflecting across my face and giving me an unfamiliar look, with none of the dreamy boy I once was. Van walked in without knocking. She carried the powerful presence of a leader, making a final inspection. "Is everything ready, Lamb?" she asked, her voice low and authoritative. She no longer addressed me with the casual familiarity of the past. She used Lamb, a name that now carried the weight of our shared work. Almost perfect, I replied, my hand gliding across the touch console. The surround system is calibrated down to each square meter. The sound layers are stacked according to the emotional map we agreed on. And the crack? Van asked, her eyes bright with expectation. That sound of innocence we tried to measure. It's integrated, I confirmed. It's not a sudden noise, Van. It's a very low-frequency resonance that appears only when the listener stands at the intersection of two different sonic fields. It lasts just 1,000th of a second, enough to trigger a faint sense of remembrance, but not enough to annoy or break the overall structure. Van nodded, her expression easing slightly. That's what I need, subtlety. Thank you, Lamb. You've done what I couldn't explain to Alistair in words. Just then Professor Alistair Reed entered, accompanied by a few renowned art critics. His face was as severe as ever, but a glint of curiosity flickered behind his thick lenses. Lamb, Alistair greeted without preamble, we'll run it one last time. I want to see if your measured sorrow actually works. Professor, I've removed the unnecessary roughness, but I kept the truth, I said. Please, everyone, into the main space. We moved into the exhibition. The lighting was tuned to create an illusion of endless depth. Abstract sculptures seemed to float in the air. Begin, Van ordered. The first sound rang out, an ancient bell recorded at a ruined temple in Asia, sustaining with the stillness of centuries. It was processed to carry a deep vibration, so listeners felt it not only in their ears but in their chests. Very good, Alistair murmured. It has weight. It has reverence. Then the sound shifted. A sequence of modern electronic rhythms began to interleave, faster, sharper, creating the sensation of relentless progress. This is the dialogue, Van whispered to me, standing beside me in the dark. Between the past and the speed of the present. Hold on, I said, my eyes fixed on the waveform displays. We were approaching the zone where I'd placed the emotional crack. As viewers passed a specific point, a wall of blue light, a subtle transformation occurred in the sound. The ancient bell seemed to stretch just slightly, and within that nearly imperceptible gap, a very soft sigh, a minute frequency mutation of the chair's creak, slipped through. It wasn't a sound to be recognized at once. It was a fleeting sensation, like a fragment of memory flashing through the mind while you're busy with something else. A nearby critic known for his harshness suddenly stopped. He frowned, tilted his head, as if trying to catch something that had already gone by. "What was that?" he asked aloud, turning to the person next to him. "I feel like I just remembered something important, but I can't grasp it." Van smiled, satisfied. That was the desired effect. Alistair Reed, standing near me, suddenly turned to look at me, the scrutiny gone from his eyes, replaced by pure astonishment. "Lamb," Alistair said, his voice respectful. "What happened at bar 32? I saw an extremely small frequency shift, but it changed the entire emotion of the passage. It brought an unexpected warmth." I kept the composure of a professional. "It's the resonance of acknowledgement, Professor. I integrated a processed sample to emulate the emotional distortion when someone accepts a difficult truth while simultaneously finding release in it." "You measured emotion?" Alistair asked, scientific skepticism threading his tone. "I measured the frequency of acceptance," I corrected, "and I used technique to make it resonate with the listener's ear. It isn't randomness, Professor, it's designed randomness." Van stepped closer, her face radiant. "Professor, that is the essence of this project. We can't talk about heritage only with static sounds. We must show that heritage is still alive in the choices we make today." Alistair looked at Van, then at me, and a faint smile, his first I'd ever seen, appeared. "Ms. Van, Mr. Lamb, I must admit I was wrong to doubt him. You are not merely a sound engineer, you are a decoder of the soul. You took something intensely personal, deeply vulnerable, and turned it into an indispensable part of a global artwork. That recognition, from Alistair Reed, was worth more than any award. It confirmed I had succeeded in fusing my two worlds. After the exhibition's success, Van and I stayed in the control room to discuss next steps. The atmosphere was far more relaxed. Professional tension had been replaced by shared confidence. "Lamb, your work has surpassed my expectations," Van said, leaning against the console, her eyes settling on the cedar box. "You did what I didn't dare to do for 10 years. Face the past without letting it control the future." "You too, Van," I replied. "You transformed your family's rigid dictates into a powerful artistic vision. You learned to wield power to protect truth." "We took different paths," Van reflected, "but perhaps because we took them, we can stand here and see the whole picture so clearly." "I used to think separation was a failure," I confessed, "but now I understand it was necessary. If we had stayed together, one of us would have had to sacrifice too much, and then we would have resented each other for it." Van nodded. "Exactly. We protected our most beautiful memory by letting it break the right way. I didn't need to contact you to know you were fine. Your music said everything." "And you as well," I said. "Your success affirms you found your path. I didn't have to follow you to prove love." We shared a long, deep look. No awkwardness, no regret, only complete understanding of the choices that had shaped who we were. It was the end of a romantic chapter, but the beginning of a relationship built on deep respect. "So, about the next project," Van said, switching topics professionally. "I want you to start researching the sound of silence. Not soundproofed silence, but philosophical silence. Any ideas?" "Yes," I answered immediately, excitement rising. "Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the absolute harmony of frequencies. It's like finding the perfect balance between poetry and technique. I'll start by analyzing the pauses in the works of the poets you love." Van smiled brightly. "Wonderful. Lamb, I trust you. Bring the honesty of that sea into what we do here." In that moment, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was standing at the summit of my career, recognized for the very part of my soul I once thought a burden. The memory gem still lay in the wooden box, but now it was no longer a frozen keepsake. It was a transmuted energy source, used to create new sounds, sounds powerful enough to shape an entire artistic world. The success of Resonant Memories was not just a milestone in my career. It was the most eloquent proof of the philosophy I had struggled to find for 10 years. The critics, famous for their harshness and their talent for spotting flaws, bowed to the subtlety of the precisely measured crack. They called it artistic courage, the willingness to bring human imperfection into the framework of modern technique. I sat in the control room, watching the crowd through the soundproof glass. They weren't just hearing the sound, they were feeling it. They stopped at the points of intersection, where the stillness of heritage met the urgency of the present, and at those very moments, the ultra-micro-resonant frequency I had crafted, the sound of acceptance, slipped through their minds, prompting them to question their own choices. Van stood composed, receiving congratulations from patrons and major artists. She was the image of absolute control, but I knew that deep within, she was sharing this pride with me. Together, we had built a sonic bridge between two worlds. As the party thinned out and only the closest remained in the office, Van invited me into the private conference room where we had first spoken. "Lamb," Van began, her voice dropping as the door closed, shutting out every outside noise. She poured 2 glasses of red wine, something we once knew only from films. "We succeeded, a resounding success. I have to thank you. You gave this fund a soul no other technician could." I raised my glass, watching the deep red reflect the soft light. "I'm only doing what I do best, Van. And more importantly, I'm doing what I learned from you." "From me?" Van arched an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "From me? I only set the strategy." "No," I shook my head. "You taught me to value truth, whether it's rough or imperfect. When you chose to leave, painful as it was, that was the truest act you could do for yourself. And when I chose to stay, that was the truest act I could do to protect that memory. We learned that from each other." Van took a sip, her gaze far away. "I remember that night at the breakwater. I was terrified to make that choice. I feared that studying abroad would turn me into someone even my father wouldn't recognize, and I feared you would hate me for not staying. I once hated myself for not being brave enough to follow you," I admitted, feeling a long-delayed relief. "But that hatred didn't last, because I realized that if I had followed you, I would never have found acceptance within myself. I'd be a dreamer forever lost in your world." "And me too," Van said, a rare tremor in her voice. "If I had stayed for you, I would never have this autonomy. I would remain the obedient daughter following my father's plan. My success today isn't about proving anything to him. It's about proving to myself that I can shape my life, even if I must walk the path he sketched. We used our most painful choices to become ourselves," I concluded, "and that's worth it." Van set down her glass. "Lamb, I want to ask you something I've asked myself many times while listening to your music. That crack, that ultra-tiny sound you created, what is it really?" I smiled gently. "It's the creak of that old wooden chair from 12th grade. It's the sound of our awkwardness when you first sat next to me. It's the sound of the first realization that I was in love." Van closed her eyes and I knew she could hear it, the creak echoing through the past, now filtered through 10 years of experience and maturity. "Incredible," Van whispered. "You turned our first naivety into the subtlest artistic signature. You did what I never dared, face the beginning without avoidance." "And you as well," I replied. "You turned family constraints into a global vision. You learned to use power to protect the values you believe in. We went quiet, not the heavy silence of parting, but the silence of deep understanding and respect. We were no longer lovers, but allied kindred spirits, the ones who understood best the choices that had shaped the other." "I don't regret anything that happened between us, Lamb," Van said, her sincerity warming me. "It taught me to cherish truth and to seek it even in the most artificial environments." "Me too, Van," I said. "Thank you for once being my muse. Because of you, I learned how to become the architect of my own sound." Van stood and reached out to shake my hand again, but this time it lasted a little longer. Not haste, but a pledge of enduring respect. "We have a lot of work to do, Lamb. Our collaboration is only just beginning." "I know," I replied, ready to face whatever the world might throw at me. I had a solid foundation, and I had a kindred ally, someone who understood my most beautiful scar. 10 years after Resonant Memories, my life settled like a mix, refined, to the point where almost no noise remained. I no longer worked under the fund's patronage. I opened a small studio in Saigon, specializing in sound design for independent art projects and documentaries, where audiences are willing to listen to truth rather than glitzy promises. My reputation was solid enough that my mother, Mrs. Lan, needed only to read a few lines in the local paper to smile over her afternoon tea. I offered many times to bring her up to the city. She just shook her head. I wouldn't be used to it. I lived in a quiet attic apartment, having installed with my own hands a surround system that could reproduce the waves of my hometown so faithfully that sometimes I doubted I wasn't living inside an illusion of my own making. The cedar box was still on the shelf. Beside it, the old guitar sat on its stand, no longer gathering dust. Tonight I sat up late, fine-tuning the sound for a documentary on the lives of fishermen in central Vietnam. I needed an even, steady transition beat for the quiet passages between the storms. Digging through old things, I found the mechanical metronome, the one that had helped me keep time for those naive early verses. I wound it. The dry but honest tick, tick, tick tapped evenly against the soundproof wall. That sound pulled me back to the moment when everything turned. I saw again Van's eyes when she sat beside me, the awkward tension of that class, the creak of the wooden chair, and the real sea behind us, not the fake waves I would later simulate. During my time in America, I once thought I could go back. I asked myself, could we start over? But then, after staying quiet long enough to hear the entire background track of my life, I understood she and I do not belong to the same world. She continued on her path, running the fund, shaping contemporary art, perhaps preparing for a trip to Europe or Asia. I returned to Vietnam, to the salty wind and the quiet I needed for my poetry, the naive kind that demands absolute freedom, including strings of lean days and desperate romanticism to take flight. I didn't fit life abroad. It overwhelmed me, and we, each of us, eventually had families. My family story began with a familiar surprise, Lai. The old friend of mine and Van's, the one in the group who always sent check-in emails, always worked backstage, taciturn but delicate. The day I decided to leave America, because I knew I didn't belong there, I came back to Saigon and made the rounds of small galleries and independent screenings. By chance I saw Lai amid the crowd, her eyes still bright, concealing a worn fatigue. Then I realized, for years, whenever I shared a success or a failure, Lee had always been there, quietly leaving a short congratulations, a timely email, a ticket to a show I hadn't managed to request. There was a time, during a conversation when she came to the city, saying she was still chasing risky ideas. She joked that she still hadn't found her prince. I didn't understand. I even earnestly advised her, treat them with sincerity, Lai. Don't let them become a forgotten poem. Let them be a chapter continued. I realized how foolish and ridiculous I'd been. Thinking back, I remember the complicated look Lai gave me then, a look that seemed to say, how can you be so dense? I've been waiting for you. Turns out the one who didn't cherish was me. I had met the princess, a muse of my life all along without knowing it. I confessed to Lai on a drizzly evening, after I'd just sent off a mix. I spoke so awkwardly that when I finished, I was surprised to see Lai burst into tears. She said she'd waited far too long for this. You fool, she laughed while wiping her tears. I hinted so many times and you wouldn't get it. Mai's lashes were still wet, but she hesitated, her voice dropping. But I don't want to be Van's replacement, Lamb. I'm afraid I'm only the space someone else left behind. I was about to blurt out, you're not, then managed to stop, lowering my voice like easing a fader slowly into place. You're not a replacement at all. If I needed a shadow, I wouldn't be standing in the rain tonight to tell you this. I took a deep breath, listening to the patter on the eaves as if counting my heartbeat. All this time, whenever something good or bad happened, my first instinct was to call you. I texted you before I told my mother, before I congratulated or blamed myself. A project approved, a mix gone wrong, a screening that went well, or a sleepless night. The first voice I wanted to hear was yours, not because you resemble anyone, but because only you understand the rests between my notes. I looked straight into her eyes. I once chased things that weren't mine, flowers in the mirror, the moon in water, breathtakingly beautiful, but they dissolve the moment you reach out. Only when I stilled myself, stepped away from applause and glittering promises, sat alone in a small room in Saigon, did I see your footprints have been beside mine all along. I realized there has always been a place in my heart for you that I hadn't yet learned to read. Now I know it bears your name. I pressed my lips into a smile, light as wind. I'm not asking you for a chance to replace the past. I'm asking to write the present and the future with you. If I fail tomorrow, you're the first I want to tell. If I succeed tomorrow, you're the first I want to hold. That isn't replacement, that's your place, and it has been for a long time. Lai was silent for a moment. The rain poured a thin layer over the streetlights. I only fear that one day the old waves will drag you away again, she whispered. From now on, I'll still listen to the waves, I said, but not to go back, rather to keep going. You are my shore, a real shore, not a reflected horizon. The past is a finished recording. You and I are the live performance I want to play for the rest of my life. Lai let out a small laugh through her tears. She nodded very slightly, like a note landing on pitch. I took her hand, fingertips chilled by rain warmed in my palm. Somewhere the rain changed tempo, and I knew I had just pressed another record button, not on the machine but in my heart. We married. Then our son was born, sleeping soundly each night to background music as soft as mist that I played very low. Lai understood me as few do, both the long silences and the fine-grained obsessions of the trade. She knew I had once loved Van. The old group still occasionally kept in touch by email, sharing joys and sorrows, each on their own orbit. Lai never asked me to brush away the past. She simply set the cedar box on a high shelf, dusted it and left it there. Tonight, as the metronome's tick, tick, tick touched that old memory, I reached out and brushed the lid. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I had said goodbye to Van with the gentlest silence, the silence of someone who understands that love is not a chain, but a catalyst, pushing us out of our comfort zones to find a better version of ourselves. I knew she was happy in her way. I was too. The studio door opened softly. Lai came in carrying a cup of ginger tea, her steps knowing the path between cables and speakers. She set the cup down, sat beside me, and didn't ask anything at once. I stopped the metronome. The tick, tick, tick ceased, giving way to a warm quiet, not the absolute silence of a studio, but a silence with the breath of loved ones. "What are you thinking?" Lai asked, her voice low and gentle, like a low note. "I was rereading a few old lines," I said. "Lines I wrote here years ago with memories of Van." Lai nodded. She knew. She always knew. I opened the computer, found the recording of real ocean waves that Coy had once sent, a former shoreline unedited, the rise and fall of the water like a human heartbeat. I played it very low, just enough to feel my chest open a little wider. Then I read, no longer trembling, as if reciting a poem I knew by heart. "You are no muse, nor am I a dreamer of songs anymore. This love is light as wind, yet it presses heavy scars upon our hearts. This love's voice is fragile, now broken, it must be so. Set aside those guileless days, give them all back to you." I looked up at Lai. "These words," I said, "I've said them to the past. I've given it all. To Van, to a time when I was still clumsy." Lai smiled, touched the lid lightly, then placed my hand on it. "Then who is your muse now?" she teased, her eyes bright like a late-night street lamp. I smiled. "Now, you are the muse of my life," I said, each word light but sure. "My life is a new poem, a new song, and that song still needs us to finish it." Outside the window, city lights spread like constellations pulled down close to the ground, not the sallow glow of those old seaside lamps, but enough to give me my own horizon. I switched off the ocean recording. Now the sea was inside my chest. We went to check on our son, the boy rolling in his small sleep, breathing evenly like a long-held note. I reached to pull up the blanket. Lai kissed his forehead. For a moment, I heard sounds I'd once overlooked. The wall clock's hand slowing slightly when a draft blew through, the rustle of Mai's clothes as she turned her head, the wind cut off at the balcony rail and stitched back together at the far end of the eaves. All of them were frequencies of truth, frequencies I had gone far to learn to recognize, only to find them at home. Back at the desk, I opened the project session. The mix on philosophical silence, still unfinished, suddenly had new material. Our child's breath, a soft laugh from Lai. The kettle just clicked off. I dragged the tracks into new positions, added a rest where the heartbeat could be heard most clearly. Alistair Reid once told me some silences are not to be filled, but to let the listener recognize themselves. I think I finally understood that completely. I no longer contacted or looked for Van. I knew she had long strides on her path, and I had found mine. The old love broke apart but wasn't a loss. It was a gift, a paving stone. I closed the cedar box. I didn't lock it. Time, maturity, and acceptance had locked it for me. "Thank you, Van," I whispered very softly, a farewell sent into gentle space. Then I turned, took Lai's hand. "And thank you," I said, "for arriving at the right time, staying in the right way, for giving me a chance to enter your life, for giving me a new chance to love you deeply, without bounds." I would still return to the wind of the sea whenever I needed ideas, short trips home to breathe in the salty scent and listen to the vast silence of the horizon. But I no longer had to borrow the sound of waves to remember. I carried it with me in a small family, in a studio that knows how to breathe, in a heart that learned to listen after love broke. The night deepened. I titled the new project, Our Song. Then I hit record, unhurried, because I knew this song needs two people, and we have a lifetime to finish it. Author's Reflection. As I close this final page, I feel as though I've finished a long symphony woven with threads of nostalgia and bittersweet acceptance. It's a strange feeling, as if I've finally exhaled a breath held for 10 years, since the day Lam and Van sat together under the old flamboyant tree. Stories of youth and first love always make me want to write slowly, because they touch the fragile, elusive beauty of adolescence, where small decisions carry the weight of fate. Each sentence, each passage, is an effort to catch those rare moments of intersection when idealism collides with reality, and both must transform to keep existing. But what I most want to keep is a small yet deep realization. Sometimes what truly belongs to us sits right in front of our eyes, steadily present in the simplest gestures. We don't recognize it because we're busy mourning the past, chasing what isn't ours. Flowers in the mirror, the moon on the water breathtaking, but they vanish at a touch. What belongs to us often arrives in a plain guise, a voice that knows how to listen, a hand that sets the wooden box on the shelf and leaves it be, an email landing at the right moment, a breath lying beside you at midnight. Through Lam's journey, I hope you see that not every love needs a happy ending to become enduring. Sometimes a timely fracture, kept in the right way, is the most beautiful preservation. And maturity is not only knowing how to say goodbye to the past, but knowing how to speak the right name of the one walking beside you now. Writing this story, for me, is also an exercise in listening, turning down the reverb of nostalgia to hear clearly the frequency of truth in the present. Amid the noise, there are still rests long enough for the heart to answer, "I am here." Your presence, you who have listened with me to Lamb's heartbeat, has made this story more alive and meaningful. Thank you for walking with me along youth's sunlit, wind-swept roads. I hope that on your own journeys, you'll pause long enough to recognize what has always been beside you. Dare to release beautiful illusions that aren't yours, to embrace what is ordinary but right, and then each of you will continue to write your own song with a worthy companion here and now.